Boom.
Whichever one. French roast is the most, right? You can just. Okay.
Okay, we are now officially live.
Wait.
Make sure that I'm muted. I'm now getting our live link. And tweeting it out. You both are tagged.
There we go.
This is an unfair advantage. You got Layne's face on there.
What's up, guys? We're going live for this nutrition debate. Is sugar harmful? Low carb versus low fat? Me versus Dr. Tro with Dave Feldman moderating. Swipe up, go check it out, and donate to the links. Guys, we're going live for the.
I got to get more on Instagram. I haven't even gotten the culture of Instagram down yet.
Listen, it's unfortunately it's just going to be one of those things where it's like the Borg. You're eventually going to be a part of it. I'm having to accept that myself.
No, I'm part of it. I don't get the culture on it. It's so different.
Well, it's just I think it's an age thing because I don't get TikTok.
Yeah.
So I get Instagram, but not TikTok.
Yeah, TikTok I get a little bit more. I understand TikTok, but Instagram, it's like the culture is a little different, and my viewership is different. Like Twitter is 2/3 male, Instagram is 2/3 female. Like, how does that happen? You know, the message is the same.
I just dislike that I can't post things on Instagram as easily from the desktop. They force you into doing so much from your phone.
Are we doing this now? Are we?
Yeah, has everyone gotten their respective links up?
Yeah, we're good, man.
I just retweeted to maybe I could retweet to Facebook, but I don't really know how to do. Let me do that right now. Hold on. Thank you.
Big set of brown.
Yeah, it's a big nothing.
Sure.
Do you have access to Hootsuite?
Mm-hmm.
Can you post Dave Feldman's thing to it all?
Already.
Got it. Okay, perfect.
All right. So you guys ready?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to a nutrition debate between two very prominent voices. I do want to emphasize before I get started that this is for charity. If you look at the link down below, you'll see citizensciencefoundation.org/debate. If you go and visit that right now, you'll find links to 3 different charities. Layne Norton has offered up. Layne, you want to go ahead and tell us the charity of your choice?
Yeah, so I'm asking people to donate to Autism Speaks. Selfishly, this is near and dear to my heart. My son is blessed with ASD, so would love to get some more money to understand more about that condition. So please do donate, even if it's $1 or $2.
Tro, do you want to tell us about the charity you've chosen?
Yeah, actually, both your charity, Dave, which is the Citizen Science Foundation, and a new organization that we are getting started, the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners, which is a consortium of doctors coming together so we can sponsor more independent research and more camaraderie amongst physicians, so we can get more nutritional studies out, and potentially even metabolic health and nutritional studies in things like autism, so which I think is desperately needed. And not just autism, but obviously also other metabolic health issues, diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. So that's SHMP.
All right, let's go ahead and get to your bios. Second. First, Dr. Tro, who is described as crusher of anti-low carb nonsense and anti-sugar crusader in the right patient population, severe obesity, parolee, tied, unwilling unwillingly to the evil
Unwillingly.
food
Yeah.
unwillingly to the evil food industry only by an amazing wife who recognizes food addiction. And you'll be debating Layne Norton, PhD, owner of BioLayne LLC and co-founder of Carbon Diet Coach nutritional coaching app. He has a PhD in nutritional sciences and is a professional drug-free bodybuilder. This is the format. We have three main questions of exploration. We'll get to those in a moment. As a question is announced, each participant will be given 5 minutes each for a statement on that question. Following both statements, we'll then open it up for conversational debate. While debating, each participant is encouraged to avoid talking over each other, but likewise keep from talking at length for more than a few minutes at a time to give the other an opportunity to respond. And perhaps most importantly, let's keep this friendly, stick to the science, and please avoid personal attacks. Both participants also suggested that it'd be a good idea to share conflicts of interest. So I wanted to give you guys both an opportunity. Why don't we start with you, Layne?
Sure. So I have several businesses in the fitness industry. So one, I used to offer nutrition coaching, but we have a team of nutrition coaches. We do not promote any one dietary approach. We try to find what is most fitting for the individual and their lifestyle. I have several nutrition books, of which none promote a particular nutritional intervention, but more so just education and trying to, once again, find what fits the person's lifestyle. I have a nutritional coaching app called Carbon Diet Coach, available on iOS and Android, where we do automated nutrition coaching. We have options from plant-based, balanced, low carb, reduced fat, even a ketogenic option. So while I do make money, I do not have a vested interest in any one particular diet. And I do receive free Monsters, sugar-free Monsters, because Monster likes me. So I think that's important to note. I got a shipment yesterday. Thank you to the evil Monster Corporation. And then I received my research for my PhD was in protein metabolism. And we received funding from the National Dairy Council, the Egg Nutrition Center, and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association.
Dr. Tro?
Yeah, my personal dietary bias, I'd say I've failed every diet. I've succeeded in every diet, and I've failed every diet, including flexible dieting. And I've had personal success with a low carbohydrate diet. So I think it's relevant for people to understand that you're talking to somebody who's had personal success with a low carbohydrate and intermittent fasting approach. In terms of financial disclosures, I have a podcast called the Low Carb MD Podcast. So clearly we promote low carbohydrate approaches, but certainly we will respect that it is not right for everybody, and we respect the needs of the individual. But certainly we are against particularly the bias against low carb, and we'll talk about that. So the podcast receives 0 commercial interests. Okay, there's absolutely no corporate sponsors. There's no commercials. My wife, which I have to disclose, okay, my wife owns a company that makes low carb cookies and cakes and protein brownies and etc. So I have to disclose that, even though I've received no money from that ever. And to be honest, and I know she won't be happy about this, she's not taken a salary doing it either in the past 2 years, donating to hospitals over taking a profit after seeing them get basically donuts and Krispy Kreme and Burger King and Coca-Cola. She said enough is enough. And before even giving herself any money, she has donated to several healthcare organizations during this COVID outbreak. That's how strongly she feels about it, but I have to disclose it. So there you are. Oh, and I have a practice that, as Layne said, we promote any diet that works, but certainly people come to us specifically for low carb approaches because they find that they can't get that expert help elsewhere.
All right, so I did want to insert two other quick notes. One as a kind of a last minute addition. My lovely wife is over here being timekeeper. So while we know there's not going to be a completely equal amount of time shared between both of you, if there is one person who seems to be running a bit more than the other, I may give a friendly warning. Likewise, if anybody is talking, say, more than 5 minutes at a time, I may also give a friendly warning at my discretion. The second major important thing is that Layne anticipated being able to do screen sharing and therefore has prepared many materials to be able to show. But we hadn't actually had a conversation about it ahead of time, but we brought this up to Tro as a possibility. And Tro was kind enough, even though he hadn't prepared. And again, this is more on me in that I wish I had anticipated this question to come up in our negotiations first. Has taken a few minutes to put together studies, but we all concede he was a little less prepared in that regard. And so in both cases, each participant is allowed, if they need to say, hey, I'd like a little bit of time to find this relevant slide or this relevant graph and so forth. So just wanted to give everyone a heads up on that. Otherwise, I think we're all good to go. Let's go ahead and get to the first question. Again, each participant will have 5 minutes to give their opening statement, and then we'll move on to the conversational debate in response to each of these major questions. The first major question is sugar harmful? We'll go ahead and start with you, Layne. Go ahead and give us your opening statement.
Okay, I'm starting my. Do you mind? Can you enable screen sharing real quick, Dave? Sorry.
Yes, sorry about that.
That's okay.
It's interesting. It doesn't seem to be telling me the option is not available.
It says host participant, host disabled participant screen sharing. Probably something in settings is my guess.
Yeah. Sorry, one moment.
Oh, here we go. I think I've got instructions for you, Dave.
Okay. It's very odd because normally it's under security. And I don't know if they had just changed where the...
Let's just go with it. I like the idea of going with it.
Oh man, I did so much preparation. Okay, if you can't find it, I'm happy to go ahead and I can share my slides afterwards. I just wish we had visuals because it really helps.
I'm gonna actually just see if I'm not sure if they've changed it. It used to be under security, and I don't know if there's something special about doing this on YouTube Live or what, but normally what they do is they have under allow participants to, it normally has share screen. Okay, I've clicked it on and then back off again. Try it now.
There we go.
Okay.
Sweet. Thanks, Dave. All right, cool. Here
I guess
we
it
go.
needed to be toggled. That's very funny.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just an update thing. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to start my timer. So just real quick, I have written out my position stand just so it's clear. My position stand is that sugar is likely only harmful in the context of increased energy intake and low satiety. Based on available literature, it is unlikely to be an independent causative factor for obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, or cancer. So what I mean is that insofar as sugar can make you, specifically, especially sugar sweetened beverages, can make you overconsume calories, it is a risk factor, but that is completely tied to the energy intake therein. So right now I'm displaying two meta-analyses. The first one is from Fator et al. From AJC in 2016. So just for our viewers who are watching, meta-analysis is basically a study of studies. So they take studies that ask a similar question and they attempt to compile all the data and come up with a consensus. So this is the effects of free sugars on cardiovascular disease markers. This open box down here is the summation. As you can see, it doesn't favor either one. Same thing over here from Moringa et al. This actually even includes sugar sweetened beverages, but calories equated, so that's important. Fructose, also not an independent cause of obesity. So this is studies on obesity and weight gain and looking at fructose versus no fructose. This study right here where you see, so this actually slightly favored fructose. I don't believe fructose is protective for obesity, but again, does not seem to be causative. And the authors concluded fructose does not seem to cause weight gain when it's substituted for other carbohydrates in diets providing similar calories. Sugar is not an independent cause of type 2 diabetes. Here's another meta-analysis looking at a summation of all these studies here. As you can see, no difference. In fact, it's leaning towards protective. Again, I don't think it's protective, but certainly does not seem to be an independent cause for obesity, independent of calories. And this is also true of sugar sweetened beverages when you control calories. Now, the problem with sugar sweetened beverages is people drink sugar sweetened beverages and they don't do it as replacement. So if they drink 150 calorie soda, they don't typically say, well, I'm going to cut 150 calories out elsewhere. They don't do that. But that is a dependent, that would be a dependent variable as far as an independent cause of obesity, or this is actually HbA1c, you see no effect. And this is a meta-analysis of looking at liver fat when under isocaloric conditions. So they're not overfeeding fructose, it's just part of a normal diet, and in comparison to other carbohydrate, no difference. If you overfeed it and you don't account for calories, you can have increased liver fat, but once again, that's increased energy. Sugar has minimal to no independent effect on cardiovascular risk. Again, these are several meta-analyses here. This is on blood pressure, no difference. Here we have for HDL cholesterol and I believe LDL cholesterol. And actually, yeah, so this one, a little bit of difference on HDL cholesterol, but there was asymmetry. And once they corrected for it, they didn't really see a difference. Fructose does not independently modify blood lipids either. So here, this meta-analysis, no difference. And over here, this is HDL, fructose versus carbohydrate. These two controlled calories, the previous one did not. So Markram conducted a systematic review on sugar intake and cancer and concluded, taken together, no results were observed for the consumption of total sugars and sucrose. Any random association between sugar and various cancers are weak at best and don't control for calorie intake. Any increased risk of cancer due to sugar is likely just from increased energy consumption. So what I'm not saying is I'm not saying sugar is good for you. I'm not saying you should eat sugar. And in general, sugars are not very satiating. And in the case of sugar sweetened beverages, people don't substitute the calories. They simply add more on top. However, if it does not cause an energy surplus, it can be consumed with little to no negative health outcomes. And just a nice graph showing that as obesity has increased over the last 30 years, sugar intake has actually gone down over that time. And there's also numerous, I'm going over time here, but there's numerous hunter-gatherer tribes like the pygmies that consume up to 80% of their calories from honey, and they don't develop obesity, diabetes, or heart disease. And I'll end it there.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Tro again, and I feel like it's worth putting in some extra emphasis. Tro is not anticipating screen sharing, so I realize your statement, I don't know if you have a prepared statement, Tro, but it wouldn't be surprising and shouldn't be surprising to the audience if he hasn't likewise prepared slides.
That's fine. Well, I'll talk about it. I'll share slides in a second. Okay. Guys, I'm a physician, board certified in internal medicine. I deal with patients with diabetes every day. I'm board certified in obesity medicine, and I help people lose weight every day. And what you've seen right here is essentially the message propagated by two organizations, okay? The International Life Sciences Institute which is a research arm of Coca-Cola. Okay, and they have propped up and paid for a lot of the research that Layne is going to share with you. So literally, the people who care about promoting the promotion of sugar because and want to blame you for increasing your intake, as he alludes, those people are ILSI, who sponsored Seven Piper, the Corn Refiners Association, who makes high fructose corn syrup, literally sponsors the research that he just posted. Philip Prinz, who literally is paid for by the German Sugar Association, which Layne will talk about. He is literally paid for by the sugar industry. And when you look very closely at the studies that Dr. Norton is going to show, particularly of NOD, where they do a calorie for calorie comparison of low carb to balanced diet approaches, what you'll find is extreme bias, okay, in their work and multiple errors in their work. So the message you're getting that Layne is giving, even though he's cautioning you not to eat sugar, which I 100% agree with, and that message to say that if your calories are balanced, there's not a negative impact, those aren't necessarily wrong. In fact, I believe him. I believe that if you are hungry, if you're cachectic, if you're anorexic, there's no reason why you should withhold sugar. But if you have metabolic syndrome, right? If you have metabolic syndrome or a component of metabolic syndrome, which is 88% of the United States, you will not benefit from having sugar or added sugar in your diet. Calorie for calorie, you will get fatty liver. As added sugar goes up in intake, okay, you will develop cardiovascular disease. Okay, and this has been shown in association studies. Okay, when you restrict sugar, you will calorie for calorie improve fatty liver, which is a strong component of metabolic syndrome. Okay, when you add fructose in the form of a beverage, okay, fructose alone or glucose and fructose, you will preferentially cause the dyslipidemia of metabolic syndrome. Okay, I want to bring that up here. Literally, you will cause LDL to form, and they have just shown this. This was just published in September of 2020, where they literally gave children and healthy adults fructose alone, glucose alone, and the combination. And they've shown that not only is fructose harmful, but the combination is even more harmful by two processes, increasing LDL and increasing uric acid, and literally causing the mitochondria, basically lowering your metabolism. Okay? So my issue is not that sugar is primarily harmful or evil. Certainly, I would never withhold sugar from somebody who has cachexia. Certainly, who has a strong, they have no metabolic issues, they're thin, they're just like Layne Norton. They've never been obese a day in their life, and they work out extensively. I wouldn't withhold sugar necessarily. But once you step in to metabolic syndrome, once you step into obesity, which I have a lot of experience with, both personally and clinically, that sugar provides no satiety mechanism for you to stop eating. Whereas any other, whether it's fat or protein, okay, that will give you a satiety mechanism to stop eating. So sugar is independently harmful. For liver health, for your lipidemia, sugar, calorie for calorie, raises triglycerides, lowers HDL, increases diastolic blood pressure, and that has been shown in calorie-controlled studies. Not that I even care about calorie-controlled studies, okay, because I think that they come with their own issues, but in isoenergetic studies, higher carbohydrate diets have been shown to worsen metabolic syndrome, okay, increase triglycerides, lower, increase blood pressure, lower HDL. They literally cause liver fat accumulation, okay? And they provide absolutely no feedback to stop eating. So when we look at our obesity epidemic, we have to understand that yes, while glucose is a perfectly acceptable fuel source, particularly in underweight or normal weight people, it is in fact harmful for anybody, with metabolic syndrome, anybody with prediabetes or diabetes. And calorie for calorie restricting sugar and carbohydrates affects glycemia without weight loss. And we have studies to show that. I don't know how I'm doing with timing.
I'll usually give like a 5 warning on the visual. And then if it rolls a little bit past that, I'll go ahead and let you know. Since Layne was the first to give his statement, he'll also be the first with an opportunity to rebut. But we are now going to move on to the conversational phase of this question. So it's a little bit more free form. But again, just to remind you guys, go ahead and feel free to speak for a few minutes. Try not to speak for too long and allow the other person to respond to your individual points. So go ahead and we'll start with you, Layne.
Yeah, so I'm not going to bring up any funding sources because I think that if the only criticism of the study is funding, it says more about your bias than the researchers. If Tro would like to point out which specific studies were funded, I'd be fine with that. But I mean, again, my research was funded by, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. If anything, my bias should be more towards low carb, as my PhD advisor was a reduced carb proponent. That being said, I'm really glad that Tro brought up some of the liver fat data, because the one study he's bringing up, the Schwartz study in children, where they fed sugar sweetened beverages and they looked at what happened. Those subjects actually did gain weight.
Hold on, they didn't feed them sugar sweetened beverages in the Schwartz study.
Let's see here. So one of the things I wanted to bring up is nutrition. It's not just about what you eat or don't eat. It's about what you replace it with. And when it comes to liver fat, saturated fat actually has a much bigger effect on liver fat than does fructose. In fact, a study examining it directly showed that saturated fat, and this was calorie equated, they fed it was less calories in the saturated fat group. So
this was an overfeeding study, right? Just to clarify.
Sorry, say again?
This was an overfeeding study.
Yes, this was an overfeeding study for sure.
Okay.
But again, if we're going off the proposition that fructose is somehow, or sugar is somehow independently harmful, we would at least expect to see the same or less with some sort of fat intake in terms of liver fat accumulation. And specifically and I don't know what your view is, Tro, but many people in the low carb community believe that saturated fat is not a problem. So this study, they overfed either 18% of calories from saturated fat, which included, as part of overfeeding, 30% of calories from total fat. So basically over maintenance by 30% from fat, 18% was from saturated fat, versus 35% overfeeding from fructose. And the fructose group did increase liver fat by 16%, but the saturated fat group increased liver fat by 86%. There was a 70% difference in the amount of liver fat accumulation. Now, obviously, when you fed both together, it was more. And that makes sense because this group gained more weight. Actually, these groups were not significantly different in weight. And then again, if we default to the most rigorous level of evidence, which if you want to find a study to support what you already believe, you can always find a single study or two to show that. It almost doesn't matter the topic. You can find single studies. So that's why we resort to the highest level of evidence, which are systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And when those are in disagreement, then we resort to, okay, what do the most tightly controlled studies say? And so when it comes to this, we just don't see that. These changes, and in fact, actually, if I go back, even a high fat diet, they looked at just in general, because I'm only bringing this up, Tro, because I know we're getting ahead, but you brought up the point. They looked at overweight patients, non-diabetic, either eating 16% of calories from from fat, or 56% calories from fat. Body weight didn't change. or another study, so that's on the left there, and another study from Naud et al., different than Naud et al. From the meta-analysis, which found that feeding a high-fat diet, very similar, 55% versus 15%, protein equated, in both cases, the high dietary fat group increased liver fat more than the low dietary fat group. The low dietary fat group actually went a little bit down. Again, now what I'm not saying is, I'm not saying you can't eat saturated fat. I'm not saying you can't eat a low carb diet. I question whether these short-term, less than yearly studies make a big difference. But again, if the argument is fructose is going to make your liver fat, okay, but it doesn't do it as, even if it did, which the meta-analysis say it doesn't when calories are equated, saturated fat and fat in general has a more powerful effect.
My turn?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. All right. So Layne brings up an excellent study. Okay, that study was an overfeeding study. What they did is they took people basically with metabolic syndrome, and they overfed them calories, and they looked at the impact of those calories, right? And they specifically overfed fructose, which was harmful for the liver, and they overfed saturated fat. So I'm going to say right now, right here, okay, low carbohydrate does not necessarily mean high fat. Okay. And so one thing I think we both can agree on.
You mean,
right?
You mean high saturated fat? Sorry, I just want to
high
clarify.
saturated, high fat in general doesn't necessarily mean it. Okay? So removing carbohydrates, there's an effect. All right. Removing fructose has an effect. Increasing protein has an effect, and increasing fat has an effect. All right. So certainly overfeeding saturated fat, all right, will result in liver fat accumulation. And I don't deny that. If you are on the average diet and you sit down and you eat excessive butter on your average diet, your liver fat will worsen. And I don't believe that fat will somehow, extra fat will protect you from liver disease. So I agree with Layne. I just think when it comes to my patients, doc, I have fatty liver. What do I do? In 6 days on a low carbohydrate diet, you can reverse fatty liver. And here is that study. Okay, very elegantly done.
Yes, but you can also do it with a low fat diet.
Hold on. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about all the things that can lower, that can improve fat in the liver. Okay, one is total energy, and I suspect that total energy is just a reflection of reducing carbs. Weight loss can remove liver fat. Absolutely, lose weight. And this is my problem with the overfeeding study. By the way, this study, so Layne Norton, he talked about a meta-analysis looking at low fat versus low carb diets, okay, for liver fat that was published in 2017 or 18, I believe. The study that you're looking at here was a low carbohydrate Mediterranean diet versus a low fat diet, which had a higher N than almost all of the previous studies, including that meta-analysis alone. This was 180 patients, okay, randomized.
Is this protein equated? Sorry.
So it is not. It's a ad lib, okay, low carb Mediterranean diet versus a low fat diet. So, and they did prescribe the calories, but you know that there's issues with that. Now, if you look at what happened, the intrahepatic glucose certainly improved, okay, and the liver steatosis definitely improved on the low carbohydrate diet. And sorry, wrong study. I'm going to bring up another study here. When you go back, and so let's talk about the effect. Where is it coming from? Okay. In this study that both of us know very well, the Schwartz study, okay, they took adolescent kids who had liver fat, okay, and they literally substituted fructose for starch. They said, we're not even going to argue about the carbs. We know in 6 days you can remove liver fat with carbohydrate restriction alone. 6 days is all it takes to remove liver fat, okay? And this is including any effect from weight loss. But in this study, they said, you know what? Let's take out that weight loss component of the low carb diet. Okay, let's take out that component and let's just literally give them starch calorie for calorie. Okay, and what happened? First of all, some of the patients lost weight. Even though they said, here, eat this starch, some of the patients lost weight. Others didn't. And it did not matter whether you lost weight or you didn't lose weight, your liver fat got better. Okay, it didn't matter. So weight loss, what's that? And then if you put it, if you have it right here on the screen, I hope everybody could see it. It didn't matter if you lost weight. So fructose, right? Let's just understand what we know about fructose. If you remove it and substitute it with glucose, okay, or starch, your liver fat improves. If you lose weight, your liver fat improves.
According to this one study.
Well, there are other studies. If you lose weight, I mean, it's well known. You're talking about weight loss?
If you lose weight, yes, but
yeah. So weight loss is widely accepted. Okay. So now, all right, let's just figure out what's going on. Yes, he's right. According to this one study with fructose restricted. Now let's juxtapose that. There have been studies that literally have taken BMI 21 people. These are like really thin people and given them huge doses of fructose, 100 grams. Okay. What happens? Nothing happens. Nothing happens. Nothing happens to them. So let's be very clear. If we're talking about the average American who is overweight, 60% of America has diabetes or prediabetes, 60% to 70% are overweight or obese. If we're talking about the 88% that have some component of metabolic syndrome, not the 12% that are like, that are in the shape of Layne Norton. He posted at me later. He's like, he's got a six-pack, he's ripped, and he's a power lifter, right? If you're him, you probably can tolerate some of that damage, that metabolic damage, and your body will heal. But for these kids, these poor kids, just removing that fructose is all it took, whether they lost weight or not. In the average person with metabolic syndrome, diabetes, hypertension, right? The average person, 43% are obese in this country. If you take and give them 6 days of a low carbohydrate diet, their liver fat will improve. And if that meta-analysis was redone with this newer study that was just published this year with the Mediterranean low carb, it would radically skew in the favor of low carb.
Well, it would skew
just a quick moderator note, guys. We are keeping track. You have in both these responses, you guys have been roughly close to around 5 minutes each. Obviously, there's been some interjections by each of you for clarification. I'm just letting you know that I'll actually extend your time a little bit more where there's interjections from the other party to kind of make it a little bit more fair. So just as a heads up, go ahead, Layne.
Yeah, so I think I want to get back on target because we're kind of getting into carb versus fat and macronutrients, which I think the purpose of this first question is about sugar. So I think one of the things to point out really quickly, just because Tro brought it up and I want to bring it up before, is that you have to equate protein. That's a huge confounding variable. Now, I know typically and traditionally, and especially back in the early 2000s, a low carb diet was thought as the same thing as a high protein diet. And when they started, and we saw like a lot of the early studies, especially from Volek and Finney, would see benefits for like lean body mass retention and some of those other things, and even fat loss, but they didn't equate protein. Protein is very powerful. It reduces liver fat. There's studies to show that, there's a study to show that. But again, this is one of those, it actually improves glycemic control again. But again, this is one of those things where if you either want to look at a single study or you can look at the confluence of evidence. And the confluence, the consensus of the evidence suggests that fructose independently is not a risk factor for liver fat accumulation, okay? And when you substitute it out isocalorically, it doesn't have an effect except for this one study. Now, again, I'm not saying the study's wrong. I'm not saying that there's something nefarious going on. We have things called data artifacts. You can have random effects that show up as significant. It does happen. Now, if 5 studies come out tomorrow showing the same thing, well, then I'll change my opinion, or I might change my opinion depending on how those studies were done. But when it comes to a single study, and again, one thing to keep in mind, there was no control group in this study either, okay? Now, why is that important? Well, placebo is powerful. Now, I'm not saying that this was the placebo effect, but Tro, now you did speculate on funding sources and that kind of stuff. So I think I'm fair to speculate on the placebo effect, as well as just talking about, having a positive theory of what's going to happen, or, how the instructions were given, all that kind of stuff. I'm just coming up with possible ways that I think could explain this if it's not an actual effect. Now, again, science is one of those things where we evolve our understandings all the time, okay? Based on the current consensus of the data, fructose, and even though we're talking about sugar, which typically is thought of as sucrose, so especially sucrose, you just cannot say, or at least in my opinion, you can't say that it's an independent factor, independent of calories. And I have a quote here from a systematic review by Perry and Hodson, or I'm sorry, it was a review of, it was not a systematic review. It was a review of the meta-analyses on this. Based on the available evidence, it would seem that altering the, hang on, let me just make this easier. Based on the available evidence, it would seem that altering the macronutrient composition to have a higher fat, over 50% of total energy intake, may lead to increase in liver fat content. Now, again, this is not in the context, I hate percentage of calories, only from the perspective of if we're talking about 1,000 calories, is a 50% fat diet going to cause you to get fatty liver? No, absolutely not. But continuing, however, this observation appears to be attributable to increases in saturated fat, whereas increasing the quantity of PUFA or MUFA in the diet may reduce liver fat. That's also true. And actually, there's a confounding variable from one of the studies that Tro cites that I'm going to talk about here in a little while with PUFA and saturated fat. Findings from some, but not all studies assessing dietary carbohydrates suggest that diets which are high in free sugars have no influence on liver fat content. So again, this is the consensus of the scientific community. Now, it's very sexy to talk about funding sources. It gets people riled up, all that sort of thing, but you got to realize that that stuff goes both ways. If you don't think that Finney and Volek don't have vested interest in low carb, you're wrong. They absolutely have a vested interest. So be very careful criticizing funding sources because it absolutely can go both ways. Now, that being said, I tend to take research at face value. If there is a reason that a particular study that you feel that I cited was wrong or conducted improperly or that there was bias for a particular reason, I'm totally open to hearing that, and that absolutely can happen. I'm not dismissing that. But again, if we look at the question, is sugar harmful? So one of the things you said was, well, there's no benefit to eating it. Well, that's not the same question. That's not the same question. I would say that there probably is no benefit to eating sugar other than it tastes good. But that's not the question that's being asked. The question is being asked is it harmful? If we look at obesity, type 2 diabetes as an independent causative factor. Now, if we want to have a discussion about is it easier to overconsume, is it easier to overconsume, we can have that discussion. But I think in the context of energy balance and isocaloric substitution, the evidence is very strong.
Okay,
Thanks,
so I'm gonna just come in here because I think we agree on a lot. So sugar provides no real satiety feedback mechanism, probably associated with increased intake. And I was like, okay, let's just cut the BS and let me just look up, all right, whether it's weight loss, okay, and you look at low carbohydrate diets versus, and I'm talking about ad lib studies, right? Whether it's weight loss, okay, low carbohydrates in meta-analysis seem to cause a slightly increased weight loss, maybe a pound or two. So whether it's weight loss, and that's what drives fatty liver, okay, low carbohydrate diets seem to do better in the free world, all right?
Let's now, just be careful, Dave, just because we're kind of getting into question 3. So,
okay.
Sorry, Troy.
I'm going to bring it back
question
home.
2,
whether it's weight loss or whether it's the sugar alone. So we know that overfeeding sugar is bad. I'm going to put fat aside because I have thoughts about that for a second, but overfeeding sugar is bad. We both agree on that. Removing sugar, okay, removing sugar from a diet, and every evidence that I've seen of sugar restriction, fructose restriction, carbohydrate restriction in interventional trials resolves liver fat. Whether that's the increased protein or the weight loss or the fact that total intake is reduced, okay, I am not completely sure, but it seems to be, given the research that I've shown, that fructose resulting in increased uric acid and increased dyslipidemia and increased metabolic syndrome is likely a key part of that. It could be that it's both the fructose restriction and the addition of higher protein. It could be that it's the fructose restriction, the total carbohydrate restriction, and the total calorie restriction. Okay? It could be all of these play an integral role. But calorie for calorie, adding fructose, bad for the liver. Calorie for calorie, whether you lose weight loss or you don't, it seems like fructose restriction improves the liver fat. Okay, so at the face value, when a patient comes to see me and says, Doc, I got liver fat, what do I do? It's very easy for me to say, go low carb. Nobody's going to say calorie for calorie, exactly how does that work? Although I can say in 6 days, your liver fat will be resolved, according to interventional trials.
Reduced. I think resolved is probably a strong word. Reduced, but go ahead.
Yeah, reduced. Yeah, that's fine. Reduced. Okay. So here's the question that really, I think, really matters. Now they took kids, and I'm gonna bring this up. I'm gonna bring this study up. So you're gonna have to give me a second, all right? Because there was a very interesting study. I thought to myself, okay, is there some impact of actually reducing sugar or adding sugar on your protein intake? So let's say you are a gym bro, or you're somebody that believes, kind of the propaganda by ILSI or the GEBN, which are these Coca-Cola, basically research arms. Okay, and it's important to bring these up. It's important to bring these up because a lot of the systematic analysis you've seen, a lot of the meta-analysis you've seen, have literally been funded by these organizations.
Which ones?
Okay, specifically the NOUD paper, which we'll go into. Okay, and also the BMJ article that you posted looking at, which declared Jenny Craig the winner. All right, so
not what it said, but okay.
Yeah, okay, but so look, and he's right. Finney and Volek are heavily invested in low carb diets. Okay, Finney and Volek are heavily invested. And in fact, that calorie controlled study that I showed you, that improved metabolic syndrome, whether you do low carb, medium, high carb, the lower carb group resolved metabolic syndrome better, calorie and weight controlled. That was funded by the Dairy Association. Okay, but there's a difference in my mind between meta-analyses and summaries of data and authors deciding how much weight to put on each study. Okay, and the inclusion and exclusion criteria of those studies, which I think when we focus on Nowd's paper, we will really see how, I want to say, almost diabolical it is, because I found over 10 to 15 errors in that study based on their own inclusion and exclusion criteria that favored balanced diets. And then if you look at who's funding them, it's this basically the shadow organizations for Coca-Cola. So I don't want to focus on that. I don't want to focus on the errors, that they put in their meta-analysis. I really don't want to focus on it. We can sit here and go through it. It's so boring. Okay, how they weighted things wrong, how they took they took patients that dropped out. Okay, and then they weighted that study less, even though they were looking at the 52-week dropout rate versus the 12.
That's actually a scientific thing called intention to treat versus per protocol. That's validated as long as it's done correctly.
So, but here's the thing, right? So they look at people who dropped out at 52 weeks, but they're looking at the weight data at 12 weeks for everybody, right? So it's like then they're weighting it accordingly. So it always favors the balanced diet. So look, I think at the end of the day, what is the real harm of industry sponsorship? It's not that there's some evil. I don't think, even though, you receive these gifts, like my wife bakes me cookies. So I guess you can say that maybe that's a conflict. That Monster gives you energy, energy drinks. I don't think that's necessarily a major conflict. Okay. I don't think that the fact that industry sponsors studies, but what happens is there's a level of propaganda and people who want to support their own message, right? And they may make, in these systematic analysis, they favor their message. And you really see it in the Nowd paper, and I hope we talk about that a little bit, but that is the harm, is okay. But when you look at that study that was funded by the dairy industry, that I've pointed to exactly one study. If you go to my website, drcho.com/studies, there's one study that has been funded by industry. And Layne pointed it out, okay? It is the isocaloric study that looked if carbohydrates are causative in metabolic syndrome, which they appear they are. That was funded by the dairy industry. So
Sure.
that's my take. What?
I was just going to say it's time. We're a little bit over on time on your point.
Okay.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and have like a 30-second to 1 minute wrap up for each of you on this question. We'll start with Layne, and
I promise to keep it very brief.
And then we'll do question 2.
Yeah. So, great studies Tro brought up. Again, getting back to the Schwartz study, one thing I just thought of as well is food was not provided to those people. So they just increased their intake and then were kind of maintain their normal diet. The studies that I presented specifically on liver fat and low saturated fat versus fructose, those had food delivered to the subjects' homes. So that is one big potential difference. And as far as, yes, you can decrease liver fat on a low carb diet, absolutely. But there's also research showing you can decrease liver fat on low carb diet, but you can also decrease it on a low fat diet. And again, we get into individual preference, which I think we'll talk about more here in the upcoming question. So that's what I wanted to end with. And I'll leave it open for Tro to add more.
Yeah. So one last thing that I didn't really show and I wanted to show, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. This is 2020. All right. So like latest research. Does increasing sugar, right? What does it do to the average child's diet? Okay. And this is again, it's an association study. And I want to point it out here. Okay. As your sugar increases, you reduce protein and you reduce all nutrients. Basically, I shouldn't say all, most micronutrients. Okay, so this is the effect on our kids. As their sugar goes up, something, as Layne pointed out, there's always something that's getting removed. And healthy food is getting removed. Higher protein foods. If the effect of low carbohydrate diets, okay, and is actually from higher protein, well, great. Reducing your sugar will likely increase your protein. Okay, so even if it's a substitution of something that's better, okay, there is an effect there. Certainly, I think Layne brought one excellent point up, which is cautioning about overeating fat in the setting of a normal diet.
Only one?
Okay, what's that? No, I think, and let's talk about that. The one other thing that I'd like to bring up in this 20 seconds is this. When you overfeed fat, there is an intense signal to stop eating. Fat does provide, okay, you just get a lot of calories with it. So with overeating fat, you'll get a lot of energy. Okay, and there are specific signals that may impact liver health on top of an average diet. But what I'd caution most people that are listening to understand is fat provides a mechanism to stop. Okay, CCK, neuropeptide YY, these are specific hormones released by fat intake that act centrally to stop eating. Sugar does not have that. Okay, sugar does not have that. So can you overfeed somebody saturated fat at 1,000 calories for their entire life? I would say it's near impossible.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the second question. Do diets such as low carb and low fat generally work the same way? To be fair, we're going to now move to you to be responding first. Dr. Tro, go ahead.
Wait, we're not doing the
doing intros, I think.
We're gonna skip it to the end.
No, you can do it. You can. I can think it's fine. Our responses are like 5 minutes anyway, so I would say you can.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, all right. So, yeah, let's go ahead into low carb versus low fat. Okay. I'm going to come back here. We're going to talk about the specific differences of low carb versus low fat. Okay, and do they work the same? All right. Now, if the question here, now I'm going to start off right away. Okay. I agree that protein is better. I don't necessarily know that the entire impact of insulin, and I think one of the problems low carb proponents have had is their unusual focus on insulin. Okay. And absolving fat. Okay. And I don't want to do that, because I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that every part of the carbohydrate insulin model is actually correct. Okay, I don't believe in in fact, if it was up to me, I would change the name of the carbohydrate insulin model to the carbohydrate hormonal satiety and glycemia model of obesity. Because I think at this point we can say that in the short term, it does not appear now that the carbohydrate insulin model is entirely correct. Now, over the long term, I think there are some things that say maybe there's some value to believing in this model. So that's the first thing I want to come off and say. I don't even want to argue that because I think it's irrelevant. Okay? The bottom line when it comes to low carbohydrate versus low fat diets is that they work differently. Okay? There's two ways that they work differently, and I want to talk about how they work the same first. Okay? A low fat diet works by removing the carbohydrate fat combination that drives food reward. When you remove the fat from that carb and fat food reward drive, you will naturally decrease intake. And Kevin Hall showed this in a study where people who ate a unprocessed whole food plant-based diet ate very, very low fat, ate a low amount of energy. Okay? That is one way a low-fat diet works. The second way a low-fat diet works, okay, it is removing that energy density from the fat. Okay? You're not over-consuming. You're not adding fat on a low-fat diet. All right? So there's two ways in which it works. And the last way that it works is potentially, and I say potentially, by increasing fiber. Okay? By increasing fiber. All right? That may provide some bulk, and it may give some people who don't have metabolic syndrome some sense of fullness. Okay, that is the way a low-fat diet works. And does it work? It works for some people, yes. Is that how a low-carbohydrate diet works? No. Okay, first of all, as we discussed, sugar, fructose, right? These do not provide any satiety feedback hormone, whereas protein and fat provide neuropeptide YY. CCK, okay? And ketosis specifically, this is really important. Ketosis specifically, being in ketosis literally acts on the brain, okay? Prevents seizures, prevents migraines, okay? And it is believed that ketonemia, okay, suppresses appetite. And we'll talk about these studies. Furthermore, they have completely different effects on metabolic syndrome. Low-carb diets preferentially decrease triglycerides. Triglycerides are cross the blood-brain barrier, promote central insulin resistance. You may hear Layne Norton say that insulin centrally provides satiety. Okay, and while that's true, the high triglycerides, okay, the high triglycerides associated with high-carb standard American diets literally are associated with central insulin resistance. And there are studies to show this. But low-carb diets preferentially lower the triglycerides. In people who are on low-carb diets, when their glycemia stabilizes, okay, when their glycemia stabilizes, this is associated with decreased cravings. So a stable sugar in somebody who's metabolically unhealthy is associated with increased fullness and decreased cravings. Ketones themselves are associated with decreased appetite, increased fullness. Okay, so these act completely different. HDL, calorie for calorie, is increased on a low carb diet. So, and with that, LDL also increases. There is no way you can say that these diets work the same. They have completely separate effects on the body. Okay, and so to say that it all comes down to calories is very misleading. It is incredibly misleading because it does not come down to calories, and we can show it very easily. And I tell my patients this every day. If you have 2 slices of pizza, a bag of chips, and a Coke, that's like 1,200 calories. When was the last time? You'll be hungry in 3 hours. I have not met one patient who said they will be hungry in anything less than 4 hours. And what happens if you were to eat 1,200 calories of trimmed sirloin, or you were to eat 1,200 calories of eggs? You know how many eggs 1,200 calories is? That's like 15, 20 eggs, something like that, something crazy. You'd be full for a day. Okay, so now they do not work the same. And I want to talk about flexible dieting a little bit, okay, just a little bit in here, because flexible dieting looks to get the best of both worlds. Let's increase protein. We know that helps. And then let's just say it doesn't really matter as long as you meet your target. The problem with flexible dieting is this, okay? Yes, that high protein will result in a certain amount of satiety, but you can do chicken breast, Twinkies, and Doritos and possibly be, but that processed food, Kevin Hall showed that processed food will literally increase your hunger and lead to further higher intake. And that was a calorie and fiber controlled study that he did with processed versus unprocessed food. So I think that you cannot just say it's protein alone, and you cannot say that it's low carb and low fat work by reducing calories. Sorry. You got to block me, Dave, because I'm not looking at you. So or Layne or somebody, you got to come right in if I'm talking too long.
Okay.
I'm trying to be respectful and not cut you
No,
off.
but I'm not looking at you, Dave. So you gotta interrupt me, okay?
Yeah, no worries. I'm going to go ahead and give Layne an extra minute. You went for about 6 minutes, so just as a heads up.
Cool. I'll start my timer. So a few of I want to just be clear before I get started. So Tro made some points that could straw man my position. I've never encouraged the consumption of ultra processed foods, and I understand that they are much easier to overeat. And I'll touch on that, I'm sure, later in the rebuttals. But getting to the points.
I didn't mean to straw man you. I'm not trying to,
All right,
clarify your
Dr.
opinion.
Tro, sorry,
Yeah.
Dr. Tro, this part can't have any interjections. Sorry.
Yeah, so I just wanted to be clear about what my position is. So here it is. My position. So originally, I thought that this phrase was a bit nebulous. Do they work the same way? So I asked to clarify, do low carb and low fat diets cause weight loss through the same mechanism, which we agreed to? And then yesterday, I think Tro said that, well, he wanted to elaborate on that. That's fine. This is what I prepared for and agreed to. But I'm happy to discuss other things too. So my position stand, while both diets will work differentially to affect fat oxidation, carbohydrate oxidation, and lipolysis, there'll be little to no difference in fat loss when calories and protein are equated between diets. The carbohydrate to fat ratio of the diet appears to have no impact on fat loss from a physiological perspective. So this probably the most powerful study on this is, I'm really glad he brought up Kevin Hall, because Kevin Hall did a really thorough meta-analysis of the data on energy expenditure in low carb diets versus high carb diets, as well as fat loss. And basically you can see here on the left side, this is energy expenditure here, figure A. Left side favors low fat, right side favors low carb. It's actually a slight favoritism towards low fat of like 27 calories per day. Then down here, this is fat loss. Again, a slight favoritism towards low fat of 16 grams per day, possibly due to some inefficiencies in de novo lipogenesis. But that said, while it was statistically significant, I would never tell somebody, hey, you need to eat a low fat diet because you get 16 grams better fat loss per day. I think that that's physiologically insignificant. But what it does mean is that these diets, and the big important thing is not only were calories equated here, protein was equated here, because protein is very powerful. So that's one thing. Johnston et al., some people say, well, some of these diets just weren't low carb enough. Well, even though those diets ranged from 4 to 84% of calories from carbohydrate, this study from Johnston et al., where all the food was provided. That's the other thing with those studies, that meta-analysis. In every single one of them, all the food was provided. And that's huge because adherence becomes a real problem for any diet past 3 months. So they observed no metabolic advantage here. These black lines are the high protein non-ketogenic diet, and this white line is the high protein ketogenic diet. No difference in fat loss, even though it looks like there's a little difference, it wasn't statistically significant. What about insulin? Tro kind of touched on it. So carbohydrates increase insulin production. Insulin inhibits fat oxidation, lipolysis. So how could a high carb, low fat diet produce fat loss? Well, carbs don't really get stored as energy to a significant extent. Even when you overfeed calories by 50% intake, only 1.4% of stored fat came from carbohydrate. And this study actually showed higher than other previous studies where only like 1 or 2 grams in total came from carbohydrate. So this means that carbohydrate doesn't really get converted to fat unless you just get so low fat that you have no sources of fat. Dietary fat is the dominant form of stored fat in adipose, over 98%. Low carb diets increase fat oxidation. However, since more dietary fat is available, more can be stored. High carb diets decrease fat oxidation, but since less dietary fat's available, less can be stored. So in that way, they don't work the same. And this is just an example from my book, Fat Loss Forever. So a lot of low carb people will make a big deal about fat oxidation. Yes, you burn more fat on a low carb diet. So here's an example. On a low carb, high fat diet, you might burn more fat at each meal versus a high carb, low fat diet, but you're also storing more fat because you have more fat available. The total fat balance and what determines fat loss will be the balance between fat storage and fat oxidized, which is controlled by energy balance. Are low carb diets better for adherence? Systematic review and meta-analysis concluded differences between diets are, however, generally limited to trivial to small, implying that people can choose the diet they prefer among the available diets without concern about the magnitude of benefits, which I agree with. Even in the non-calorie equated meta-analyses, any differences we see in blood lipids, glycemic control, all that kind of stuff is very small, while it may be significant when calories aren't controlled. There's some evidence that low carb diets are slightly better for short-term adherence and weight loss when calories aren't controlled, but these differences disappear at 12 months and are well within the daily fluctuation of weight. Johnston et al. Conducted a meta-analysis of named diets and found similar results. Because diets are variably tolerated differently by individuals, the ideal diet is probably the one that is best adhered to by the individual. I agree 100%. And Karsmo-Hagen meta-analysis demonstrated that attrition rates were not different between low carb diets and high carb diets. Now, real quick, this is a study by Kevin Hall. Again, I know I'm running short in time, Dave. They did a high carb, low fat, high fiber diet versus a low carb diet and they let them eat ad libitum and found that on the low fat diet, people spontaneously reduced their intake. On the high fat diet, they also reduced their intake, but not to the same extent as the low carb diet. One more thing that's also important so let me just wrap it up. What I'm not saying low carb diets don't work. I'm not saying low carb diets suck. I'm not saying low carb diets make you hungry. I'm not saying low carb diets are bad for you. What I am saying is low carb diets appear to be a viable tool for reducing body weight and improving metabolic health if they allow the individual to achieve an energy deficit. They are not superior to non-low carb diets, however, when protein and calories are equated.
All right, so what I'm going to do now is, because you went first, Dr. Tro, you will also get the first rebuttal. Go ahead. We now enter the conversational phase, of course, of the question.
Okay, I hope we can, there's a lot of topics here to talk about. And I want to say nothing he said so far really strikes me as a wrong comment, okay? What I'd like to just point out is this, all right? Why would somebody in a study, right? My goal when a patient comes in is how do I get them to reduce their energy intake, okay? Without them feeling like they're actually reducing their energy intake. How do I get them to actually reduce their energy intake? So my concern, I care zero about controlling for calories. The only person or the only institution that would benefit from controlling for calories would be somebody who wanted to actually include calories that made you more hungry or favor somebody's food preference. Okay? Those are the only two ways that controlling for calories might have some useful point in getting people to lose weight. So either food preference, so they can include foods that they would like, okay, with regards to a certain caloric intake, okay, or your Gatorade and Nestle and McDonald's and Coca-Cola, and you want to focus on the fact that calories are all it comes down to and blame the patient with obesity because you didn't count your calories enough. And if you look on any vending machine,
I think real quick, I think there's a difference between acknowledging calories matter and saying you're blaming someone. I think a lot of people, when they hear that, when they hear me say calories or energy balance is most important, they say when you say calories in and calories out, you're saying that I'm a glutton and that's why I'm fat. That's not what I'm saying.
I'm not talking about you, Layne. I'm not talking about you. You know,
I'm when I say me, I'm talking about generally people who are overweight.
Yeah.
And they'll hear calories in, calories out, and they'll say that's too simplistic. It doesn't explain. Just because something is simple doesn't mean it's not very difficult to achieve. I completely agree that it's very difficult to achieve an energy deficit for most people. And I just want to go towards what works for the individual best. That I just want to clarify.
I don't doubt in my mind that, look, you can be selling crack. You could be selling crappy supplements. So I'm not talking about you. You know, I am not talking about you. I am talking about who in society benefits from controlling for calories. Somebody who wants to disprove, like in the scientific literature, somebody wants to disprove the insulin model of obesity, fine. That makes sense. Somebody who wants to somehow show that food preferences can be included in a diet based on a certain amount of caloric intake, fine. That makes sense. The other person that benefits is people selling food that make you more hungry. Right? That's the person who benefits. And if you look at the ILSI and GEBN, right, these are the people that benefit from making the focus about exercise to increase your caloric expenditure, and you choose the right amount of calories, right? Passing that blame on while ignoring the fact that there are foods, their foods literally make people more hungry. And I want to come back to Kevin Hall's study because you showed the processed versus unprocessed food. Okay. His study was really, you showed the animal-based, and I want to talk about it in a second, but the unprocessed versus processed food, calorie and fiber controlled, okay, unprocessed foods led to a 600 calorie decrease in diet. Okay. And
was fiber controlled?
Fiber was controlled in that study. Yes. They gave Metamucil to the other arm, right? To the processed food, they got fiber in there through, the way the average American does. So look, the problem here is when you like the people who benefit from saying calorie controlled, and what does that do? What bias does that introduce? Controlling for calories, right? What diet is best at lowering calories in the ad lib setting? That's a low carb diet. What diet is best for increasing protein? That's a low carb diet. So why would I,
not according to Kevin Hall's other study?
What's that? So, but that was a controlled study. Right. And Kevin Hall's other study, I want to talk about this. Okay.
What do you mean it was a controlled study? They let them eat ad libitum.
No. Oh, yeah. So you're talking about protein or calories. So let's just be clear for the viewer. Okay. For the viewer, there was two arms in Kevin Hall's study. It was animal based. Okay. Now what they did was they controlled for protein. Okay. Which means that there was a lot of fat added to the diet. Sour cream, butter, cream. Right. Okay. So that's what it took, right, to keep the protein controlled, right? The diet was a beautiful study. Low carb, okay, protein controlled versus low fat, protein controlled. And what happened, okay? Initially, the higher fat diet, okay, which I'm not necessarily a proponent of high fat, they ate 3,000 calories versus 2,400 calories. There was a 600 calorie difference, okay, starting. At the end of 2 weeks, somehow, the low carb group, the higher fat diet, what happened? They dropped their caloric intake by about 300 to 400 calories, whereas the other group stayed exactly put. There is some effect that led to a 400 calorie drop in calories over that 2 week period. Okay. And I'm going to tell you what that effect is. All right. I have the studies here and hopefully I have time to bring it up. Okay. The effect is from the fact that fat, okay, provides CCK. Okay, it works centrally to inhibit appetite. That a ketosis itself, okay, suppresses ghrelin, right? And there's studies to show this. And if I have a moment, I can bring them up. And it preferentially acts on neuropeptide YY, okay, to suppress appetite. And ketones themselves suppress appetite. Stable blood sugar. This is very important. A decrease in glycemic variation stabilizes appetite. There was a process there that led to a 600 calorie difference to start with that would drop down to a 300 calorie difference. And I suspect, and we know what happens on a low carb diet. What happens at 3 months and 6 months? It's always that a low carb diet outperforms a low fat diet. And I'm going to bring up these studies here. And Dave, you're going to just stop me if I'm doing crappy on time. At 3 and 6 months, okay, this is Mansour. There is an advantage okay, to low carb diets for weight loss. So we know at 3 or 6 months, okay, that intake is going to drop even further. And we're witnessing in Kevin Hall's study, okay, we're literally seeing it play out in action. And if you compare all diets to each other, Atkins, Ornish, whatever, in the free living world, Atkins always does better. Why? Why at 6 months does it do better? Okay, because it eventually reduces intake. Well, how does it do that, right? Even if you look at diet fits at 3 and 6 months, there was this statistical significance, right? At 12 months, the low carb did better, but not statistically significant. And my contention is they really equalize the diets, okay? But why? Okay, so I'm just going to wrap it up. One last comment, okay? So I don't think that it's fair, okay? Because in the real world, we do not tell people they have to limit their protein and they have to eat more calories so that calories are equated. We want them to eat the least amount of calories possible. We want them to have, really an unlimited protein, okay, and accept the fat that comes with it. And that's a low carb diet, and it seems to work better in the literature. I want to talk about adherence if you can and insulin, but we'll try to get to it the next time.
Oh, we'll get to that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So one of the things you've said is that sugar and carbohydrate doesn't have a satiety mechanism, but that's simply not true. So there's a meta-analysis here from dietary fat, and they looking at dietary fat and satiety, and they said overall, owing to a high energy density, fat on a per kilojoule or calorie basis had a weak effect on satiation as determined by the effect per gram for each unit of energy. And as far as carbohydrate, there's another review by Anderson et al., where they said mechanisms by which sugars may signal regulatory systems for food intake need to be considered. The relationship between glucose to sugar consumption and subsequent feeding is also examined. It is concluded that sugar stimulates satiety mechanism and reduce food intake in the short term. Now, and the mechanisms by which this occurs cannot be solely attributed to their effect on blood glucose. I'm not saying that sugar is satiating, but saying that it has no effect on satiety or carbs have no effect, that's simply not true. And obviously we know about fiber. Now, Tro, you did make a pretty large case about the Kevin Hall study, which I'm once again, I'm glad you talk about. Now, when it comes to the Kevin Hall study, you could see, yes, they did at 8 days on the diet reduce their intake a little bit, but it kind of plateaued out, but it was still much greater. Now, I will acknowledge 100% they reduced their intake and they lost weight. But one of the things we also know about a ketogenic diet is it causes quite a bit of water loss. In fact, one of the reasons people like to prescribe a ketogenic diet is because people tend to lose weight really quickly in the first week. And that tends to, at least in the short term, improve adherence because people get motivated because they've lost some weight. And in fact, not only is it water, and so this is where it gets into the nuances, but you also see a decrease in fat-free mass. And Kevin Hall showed this in several tightly controlled studies. Now, most of that is probably water. If we're equating protein, I would not expect to see a big difference. However, in his study on metabolic and behavioral effects of a ketogenic diet, where they looked at transitioning people from a high carb, over 300 grams of carbohydrate a day, and I think it was 117 grams of protein, to a low carb diet, which was under 30 grams of carbohydrate a day, they noted an increase in protein excretion. And that's also the same in this ad libitum study, where actually the group that was eating the high fat diet, this ad libitum study, was getting more total protein. They got quite a bit more total protein, and yet their protein balance was still more negative than the high carb diet. Now, again, that could be due to insulin reducing protein breakdown and that sort of thing. But once again, when we look at long-term effects of non-calorie controlled, the absolute best difference we see at 6 months is 2 kilos. And at a year, the absolute best we see is just over 1 kilo. Now, that easily can, right, but that easily can be explained by a difference in body water. And when you control calories, it goes away. Now, again, if somebody prefers a low carb diet, it is a completely reasonable thing to do, but it is simply not superior. And actually, there's a meta-analysis here. This is off scifit.net. They looked at attrition rates in keto studies versus non-keto studies, or versus the control diets, and found that the adherence was actually pretty unremarkable. The dropout rates were basically the same between diets. Now, again, I'm not saying a keto diet sucks. Absolutely not. There are some, I think when it comes to fat loss and metabolic health, the most important thing someone can do is find the form of restriction that feels the easiest to them individually. Meaning for you, Tro, you tried a bunch of different diets. Low carb was something where you didn't feel hungry, it didn't feel difficult for you, then that is a completely reasonable way to do it. For me, I used to have issues with, here's my bias, I used to have issues back in my bodybuilding career with binge eating when I was early in bodybuilding. And once I stopped saying, well, I can't have these foods, and I know this has been the same for many people as well, I just let myself have them within the context of enough protein and calories. I stopped having binge eating issues and I actually lost body fat. And I've had a lot of people have the same experience. Now, again, I don't want you to straw man me. Not that you'd purposely do it. One more point, Dave. Not that you purposely do it, but I'm not saying it's a good idea to eat a lot of energy dense foods. Now, if you're somebody who's in an energy surplus trying to get down a lot of calories, it can be a good idea if you're having trouble gaining weight or muscle. If you're somebody trying to lose weight and you're down to 1,500 calories a day, absolutely, it is a terrible idea to try to fit your macros with highly processed foods. And if you even look at the foods I eat when I'm dieting, a lot of salads, a lot of low energy density foods. I'm not eating Pop-Tarts. I'm not eating Kit Kats. I'm not eating candy because I won't be able to feel satiated and hit my caloric goals based on that. It's just like having a budget. Okay, hang on, let me stop the screen share.
Okay, so I wanna talk about it. So there's key points, and I want to talk about binge eating because you brought it up. That's something we have in common. We both have binge eating. Okay, or at least suffered from binge eating. And, we put out a case series from our practice that took people who couldn't stop eating pizza, who would eat pizza until it hurts. We took people who were eating chocolate until it literally hurts. Okay, and all we did was lower their carbohydrates. Okay, all we did was lower their carbohydrates and a complete resolution of their symptoms as measured on the binge eating scale and the Y-fast. Okay, that's all we did. We said, you can have pizza, just let's remove the carbs. This is how to make it. We wanted to, we didn't want to suppress their own desires for food. We wanted to cater to their food preference. And we gave them low carb pizza and we gave them sugar-free chocolate. Okay, and this is the thing. Hershey's could make sugar-free chocolate. They literally could make it, but it would decrease sales. Okay. And now, keto has gained such popularity that companies like Blaze Pizza, they're making low carb pizza. I have no relationship to them, right? Where people can go and lower their carbohydrates, experience the satiety and appetite changes with stabilizing your blood sugar. Okay. Only recently did this happen. Blaze, and they sold out in 1 week, meaning there's a demand for it. People want it. People want to eat this way, but they have been dissuaded for years. And to this day, I want to bring this up, okay? There are people who are on trial for inappropriately recommending diabetes. Gary Fedke, he inappropriately recommending a low carbohydrate diet. He was on trial for inappropriately reversing diabetes.
Say, if we're recommending diabetes, I might have.
All right, so there is a strong bias against the low carbohydrate approach. And on top of that, we've talked about a big propaganda arm in nutrition, and academia is sponsored by industry. You talked about it both ways, but the majority of industry is sponsored by 10 companies, all of which have high carby foods, okay, and high sugary foods. So it is not a world where people are prejudicing against low fat diets, Okay, it is a world where people are saying you have to have 130 grams of carbs. It is a world where they say if you fast, you're going to die. This is the world we live in. And I'm glad that you have on your app that you include these low carb and ketogenic worlds. But low carb proponents have been attacked when in fact triglycerides improve calorie for calorie on a low carb diet. Okay, when weight loss is nominally superior, but superior. If I am somebody who struggled with weight loss, I was 350 pounds. I don't care about everybody's ideology. I care about what's best. What's going to work the best? That 2 kilograms, that matters to me. Okay, that matters to me. And why is it better? That matters to me as a clinician. Why is there 2 calories? And you said it's water weight, but I want to talk about the unique effects of it. All right, and I put this all on my website, but specifically we talked about CCK. It's preserved with a low carb diet. Okay, we talked about neuropeptide YY. This is preserved even a year out with a low carb diet. Okay, whereas the low fat arm doesn't get it. Ghrelin, this is really key. Ghrelin is a hunger hormone. Okay, once you come off keto, your ghrelin shoots through the roof. Okay, this makes you hungry. Why? How does keto work? And then let's talk about insulin, because you mentioned insulin. Okay, is insulin the big issue here? Certainly, if we give people insulin, they gain weight. Okay, if we actually give people insulin, they gain weight. But you're right. When you look at diets and diets that keep protein the same and substitute carbs and fat, the insulin drops, but weight doesn't necessarily drop. Okay, so there's something to it. And how is it that insulin causes weight gain? Okay, how is it that drugs that typically increase the area under the curve, I'm not talking about GLP-1 agonists, how is it that it causes weight gain? Okay, they literally, okay, that hypoglycemia, the reactive drop, the glycemic variability, when that blood sugar goes up, you may feel satiety. But when it comes back down, okay, that is what stimulates hunger. That is how insulin causes you to eat more and gain weight when we administer it. That is how steroids cause you to have your blood sugar fluctuate and you gain weight. Okay.
Why didn't Kevin Hall observe this in their study? And why don't people just start putting on massive amounts of weight in these studies where they're eating a low fat diet? If insulin, because insulin is significantly higher in those diets.
So the glycemic variability, it comes down to glycemic variability, right? If you look, there's 2 reasons, okay? People who report on low carbohydrate diets, okay? People who report that their cravings have gone down, their hunger has gone down, their fullness has gone up, they have a statistically significant improvement in their glycemic variability. If you are a healthy person, like recruited in Kevin Hall's study, you will not have a significant degree of glycemic variability. If you're pre-diabetic, diabetic, metabolically unwell, and fatty liver and obese, right? You are going to experience a decrease in glycemic variability. Not only that, but the ketones, like I said, take time. They take time. At 2 weeks, we started to see that the effect started to occur even by day 8. We know that at 3 months, there's a nominal improvement in low carb diets. So we know what the trajectory would be from Kevin Hall's study. We know what would happen from 2 weeks to 3 months. Their intake would drop even further. How does that happen? It is a hormonal issue. Here's a great example of this concept that reactive hypoglycemia increases hunger. It literally causes the brain to activate the reward centers. Okay. So how much time do I have, Dave?
You're over.
About to wrap up.
Got it. Okay. Bottom line, that change. So how is it different? The diet, by stabilizing blood sugar. Okay. The people who report they have decreased cravings, there is a physiologic reason for it. It is not just calories.
I'm going to give a quick moderator note. We're looking to wrap in a little more than 30 minutes. I'm going to give Layne another 5-ish minutes for his response to keep it equal. Then about a 30 to 160-second wrap up for both of you. And then we're going to move on to the third and final question. Go ahead, Layne.
Alrighty. Thank you, sir. So a lot of the studies that you're citing, in fact, most of them on glycemic control in type 2 diabetics, they don't equate for protein. So one of the biggest ones, I know that was one of your main ones, is the clinical effects of a carbohydrate-reduced high-protein diet on glycemic variability in metformin-treated patients with type 2 diabetes. So this wasn't really a high carb versus low carb study. This is a high protein versus normal protein study. The difference in fat intake was only 40% versus 30%. The protein difference was almost double. So the fat difference was only 33%. The protein difference was 81%. And this is a big confounder. In a meta-analysis by Zhangping, they showed that protein alone, increasing protein by itself, improves HOMA-IR and other markers of metabolic syndrome like LDL and HDL. So protein independently improves these things, as well as glycated hemoglobin, so HbA1c. Higher protein improves this. And a meta-analysis of Snodgaard of low carb versus high carb diets on HbA1c in type 2 diabetics didn't show any differences at 12 months. So I just think that those are important things to point out, that one, protein is a huge confounding variable.
Steve, how does protein improve glycemia?
What's that?
How does protein improve glycemia? So we got to address it. How does it?
Well, I doubt it's going to be on insulin, only from the perspective of that protein increases insulin by itself.
Okay.
Now, you brought up some really good points about the food addiction stuff. And I used to be there's no such thing as addictive foods, this and that. And I've changed my stance on that. But let's just look at what foods are actually addictive. And you bring up pizza. Well, pizza has almost pretty much more calories from fat than it does carbohydrate, depending on the type of pizza. Deep dish versus thin crust, that sort of thing can change things. But for the most part, the calories from protein or from carbohydrate and fat are pretty similar. So this is a study of about 1,500 college students, and it uses the YFAST scale. And it looked at what was the rate of certain foods being problematic. So amongst normal weight people, sugary foods were only 5%, were problematic for 5%. So we're talking about sugar by itself, like sugar is in isolation. When we talk about foods that were actually quote unquote addictive, we're talking about high fat, high sugar, or high fat savory. Those were 25 and 29% problematic in normal weight. Now in obese, when overweight and obese, it's actually interesting. The problematic sugar intake was 3%. So less than 3% or less of people obese identified foods that were primarily high sugar as problematic, whereas 30 and 33% identified high fat savory and high fat, high sugar. And their author quote, "The brain does not appear to respond to food and or sugar in the same way as drugs, and an addictive like overeating seems to be distinct from drug addiction disorders. Sugar does not seem to contribute to weight gain more so than other sources of energy in the diet. Instead, the current scientific community nowadays seems to reach consensus that food addiction and its role in weight gain might be better explained by eating dependence as a result of unique individual experience with food and eating." Now, I want to show one more thing.
Can we talk about this? Do you mind if I interject? Can we interject here or?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so let's just stick on this. You're absolutely right. Carbs and fat combination is worse than carbs alone. Okay, and let's a quintessential example. Nobody will overeat a baked potato. Nobody. A plain baked potato, nobody will overeat it.
Very few.
Okay, yes, very difficult.
Not till you put butter and salt on it.
Yeah, exactly, or make it French fries. Okay, so every single one of the top 10 foods on the YFAST is a carb and fat combination.
Correct.
Okay, so yes, carbs and fat are uniquely addictive, but I don't know many people who binge eat olive oil or binge eat just butter alone, right? So that fat component,
or bags of sucrose,
right? Yeah, exactly. So correct, exactly. So, but well, actually, we shouldn't say that. Gummy candies, Skittles, soda, juice are high up on the Yale Food Addiction Scale. They make the top 15.
Yes, okay. But they also have processing that's done to make them more palatable. If we're going to use the comparison of olive oil, which is a kind of a fat in a semi-raw form, we have to make the comparable comparison of a bag of sucrose.
We could say butter. That's fine. Butter is processed, you know. But so okay. I mean, if we wanted to say raw beef fat, nobody would overeat raw beef fat. You know, I mean, like I don't know one person that would eat raw beef fat. Maybe Dave. That's the only person.
No, I think we agree that the processing matters.
Well, no, so it's not the processing only, okay? Because carbs and fat in combination, even like you can take strawberries and whipped cream, and you will overeat either one combined. right? So, and that happens to be a keto option. So food addiction goes beyond diet. Okay, you can take fat and sweetener and it'll probably lead to increased intake, independent of sucrose, right? Because that's sweet taste and the fat reward. So it's very complicated, but you're right. The unifying feature is a combination of carbs and fat. If you take either one of those away to an extreme, the reward drops down significantly. Sorry, I just wanted to put that out there.
No, that's fine.
I am going to have to add a few minutes to Layne's response now, but just so you guys know, this is actually the next question. This touches on a lot of the aspects.
Can we keep going? Because I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we talked about that I'd like to go into, specifically on adherence, and I'd like to, if we can keep going on this.
Let me answer that. Let me answer that, Dr. Tro. We originally anticipated that we would have a stop time at the bottom of the hour. I'm absolutely willing to go longer if both of you guys have the time, and there does seem to be a lot of people very interested in this debate. So certainly I'll open that up, but it would take all three of us to agree to that if that's possible.
I can go until noon. That's
fine. I don't have any patient scheduled to noon. So I'm good to go.
So officially right now, we're going to extend this an additional hour. I do think that this particular question is obviously one you guys are both very passionate about and have been very vocal on. So why don't we go ahead and push off the next question for at least another 20 minutes and stick with this one if that works for you guys.
Okay, so getting back, so this is and Tro brought this up. This is the YFAST scale that Schultz developed, and they're the leaders in the food dependence model. I mean, they basically do most of the work on it. And again, you see like going down, you got to get to, breakfast cereal before you're in something that's, primarily carbohydrate based. And even that doesn't really get into the level of addiction food dependence, because addiction is probably the wrong word. But, comparatively, you also see things like cheese in the top 10, right? Which is, protein and fat for the most part. Which, if we're going at cheese and bacon. So if we're going, based off where, gummy bears show up and that
have
sort of thing,
carbs, right? Just to clarify, they're also carb and fat So bacon is usually almost universally sugar is added to bacon.
most bacon I see is very low carbohydrate or zero, but
no, they add,
I'm sure there's
2 grams of sugar to bacon, but yeah, okay.
I'm sure there are types of bacon that have sugar added. I have no doubt of that. Cheese, if it's, almost any cheese is going to be very low sugar unless it's added, but I mean, that cheese is on there. So, I mean, it's a complicated issue. It's not just simply a matter of, and I think you acknowledge, there's not simply a matter of carbohydrate. It's a matter of combining foods that are hyper palatable. And I think that this kind of gets down to, and I've seen this argument in the low carb community a lot, or at least the kind of dog whistling of it, that essentially we should blame the food industry. They did this to us. It's not your fault, that sort of thing. I agree.
I agree with that.
Okay. So I think taking that approach has unintended consequences in that you can make people feel powerless to change. I think the messaging needs to be that certainly the food environment, I don't like calling the food industry evil because I don't like inferring intention. I mean, at the end of the day, the food industry sells product. They are trying to get you to eat more product, and people are eating these products. And so it's just like the news media. They put on trash news because that's what people like to consume. If people didn't like it, they would stop providing it. So there is and needs to be some personal accountability. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who's ever become obese, that it's 100% their fault. And the energy balance model of obesity doesn't say that either. Because genetics, we know that genetics are different between people who become obese and people who aren't in terms of how their brain rewards them for even viewing food. That's absolutely true. We know that trauma early in life can predispose people to obesity. That's another thing. So I am never going to sit here and say something like obesity is 100% gluttony and it's the individual's fault and they just need to eat less and move more. On a physiological level, 30 seconds, Dave. On a physiological level, yes, they need to eat less and move more. But saying that is not typically helpful in the context of trying to get them to lose weight. Trying to show them habits and behaviors that will assist them in achieving those goals so that they can create an energy deficit. That's where the focus should be. And you have done that insofar as you provide them with tools, which your favorite is low carb, of something that can help them achieve that, which I have no problems with. I would just consider myself a little more agnostic.
Hold on, I just gotta say, it is low carb in the right patient, right? If somebody comes in underweight, elite athlete, cachexia, anorexia, I would never recommend a low carbohydrate approach, right? Necessarily. Okay, so let's be careful, because I just don't want to be strawmanned either. It is preference. If somebody,
I was speaking about overweight and obese, so
well, I'll even categorize that. We have overweight and obese with very high, astronomically high cholesterol, who are very cautious on low carbohydrate approaches. Okay, we may cautiously recommend them depending on other metabolic issues. So I am in favor of low carbohydrate diets, and particularly, well, I didn't want to. You should finish up. Go ahead, Brian. I mean, Dave. Did I?
He was about out of time anyway, and it's now really more your time. We're now.
I didn't want to cut. No, but I cut him off. Layne, did you have anything else to?
No. I was good with ending there. That's fine. I was already over on time anyway.
Okay. So I want to bring up, really key points. Okay. So there's, we talked about adherence. We really didn't go into it, but I want to come into personal accountability. All right. To be personally accountable, the first thing you need to realize is the threats to your appetite in the everyday environment. There has been a strong force, okay, in the everyday environment that has said, okay, you have to lower your calories. They never said how. When you go to the doctor, they tell you lose weight. Okay. And this is my profession. This is who I was. I was a 32-year-old board certified internist working in the smartest system, okay, the most prestigious medical system in the Northeast. And my colleagues who were brilliant endocrinologists and cardiologists said, eat less and move more. Why don't you just eat less? Not any one of them understood food addiction. Not any one of them understood how sugar affects cravings, how carbohydrates affects cravings, how combining carbs and fat affect cravings. And as you said, it's very complicated. So our current medical dietetics system promotes balance of diet, when in fact we know that the extremes of diet, low carb, very high protein, one is an extreme and it works. Very low carb is an extreme and it works. Very low fat is an extreme and it works. Cutting somebody's stomach out is an extreme and it works. So I don't believe that any balance is actually needed. And I don't believe that we have to flexibly include food in somebody's diet unless they specifically state, and there's no other way around it, right? They need that food. They need that food to be happy. They want to include that food, maybe social reasons, right? Maybe mentally, they don't want to have that restriction idea in their mind. And so we'll cater to them. But the concept of, will your intake go down if you go to processed food? Yes, it will. Okay, will your intake go down if you go to an extreme of diet, whether it's low fat or low carb? Yes, it will. Okay, so we have to be clear with messaging. And should you go on a low carb diet? Yes, 60 to 70% of this country absolutely should and would benefit. Okay, absolutely should and would benefit on fatty liver, hypertriglyceridemia, metabolic syndrome, weight loss, diabetes, hypertension. And this is calorie for
calorie. But they'd also get those benefits going on a low fat diet.
Certainly, but it works a different way. So now let's be clear. So selecting the right patient for the right intervention. Okay. Now you probably deal with a lot more athletic type of patients than I do. I deal with a lot more metabolically sick patients. I know you probably deal with both. Okay. But I caution you and say, we are probably seeing two different populations. I'd imagine. Okay. I'd imagine we're seeing two different populations. Now the question becomes is what will impact your appetite? What will impact your cravings? And is it just complicated? I don't believe that it is complicated. If you reduce the fat component of that carb-fat combination, your intake will drop. If you reduce the carbohydrate component of that fat-carb combination, your intake will drop. They both affect reward, but low carb preferentially stabilizes blood sugar, okay, preferentially lowers triglycerides, which causes central insulin resistance, and is probably more preferable in metabolic syndrome, severe obesity, and diabetes. And now you talked about protein. I just want to hit this because you said protein is a confounder. Protein is not a carbohydrate, so it is not a confounder. So increasing your protein along with a nominal increase of fat in the absence of carbs is what causes glycemic stabilization. Full stop. Now, I wish I can, make this really easy for you and show it in the medical literature, but ask any surgeon who puts their patient through a bariatric procedure. They stop insulin on day one. Okay, they stop before weight loss, before any major dietary change. Put somebody on a CGM, and the reason why I brought up this study, put somebody on a CGM and cut their carbohydrates day one, their glycemic variability improves. And the reason why I brought this study up, you're right, it was controlled for total energy, not protein. So protein was higher, but protein is not a carb. And what did it do? It improved their glycemia. Okay, it improved their glycemia, calorie for calorie. Anybody with a CGM will know that carbohydrates increase glycemia. And this was a study recently published that demonstrated it calorie for calorie. And that's why I brought it up. Okay, so it is not the same low carb. And put protein aside for a second because it's not a carb, right? So let's not equate low carb with high fat. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. So there's a lot to unpack there. One of the things I'd like to start out with is kind of, we've been touching on it throughout this debate, but individual preference and messaging. So I think I have no problems with somebody recommending low carb diets. I think the messaging is very important. I work with a lot of people who have come to me who are absolutely petrified of eating carbohydrates, or I've had people less so scared of eating fats. It's kind of swung the other way over the last 30 years. And what happens is they have trouble sticking to a low carb diet. Not all, some people do very well on it. We have quite a few people using a ketogenic option on our app. But they have trouble sticking to it. And then if they have any amount of carbohydrate, they feel like they've completely failed and they might as well just give up. And so the messaging needs to be, yes, low carbohydrate is an option if it feels like it's easier for you. But we cannot discount people who just don't do well on it. And obviously there are people who don't do well on it because attrition rates are very similar between a low carb ketogenic diet and a higher carb or balanced approach. So that being said, we have people all the time, should I do a ketogenic diet using your app? Well, do you like it? Does it feel easier for you? Intermittent fasting, people think I'm anti-intermittent fasting. I am not anti-intermittent fasting. I'm anti doing mental gymnastics to justify why intermittent fasting is better. And this is what you see pervasively throughout many of these communities. And plant-based is no different. They're probably worse in some ways, is the purveyance of, I like this. So now I'm going to go try and find scientific justification for why this is the best thing in the world. And I started to fall into that back probably around 2011, 2012, I would say. I kind of got to the point where I was like, you know what, flexible dieting, this works so well. I've seen so much results with this, with clients. This is what everybody needs to do. And then after going through enough people and going through the scientific literature, I realized, well, that's not necessarily true. Some people do extremely well on it. Some people don't do so well on it. Some people find it easier not to track their macros. That's fine. I've got no problems with that. Like I said, I've become much more inclusive over the years. But it would be like me going, well, flexible dieting, not only is it just as good as everything else, it's actually better because it boosts your metabolism and makes you gain more muscle and all that. Well, that's not true. That's not true when protein is equated. I want to demystify some of this stuff because we have so many people who are so petrified of eating anything, and anxiety around food is at an all-time high, then I don't care if somebody wants to eat a low carb diet. That's fine. I just want them, and I don't even care if they don't understand personally why they're eating it or why it works for them. I want the practitioners to be honest in their messaging. That's more of what I want to see. And like I said, as far as adherence goes, it's all over the board with any diet. All diets tend to be equally terrible at adherence. Again, I and you both suffer from selection bias insofar as the people who come to me or come to our app or come to our community already have likely self-selected that they prefer flexible dieting. So of course it works better for them. Or they come to us because they've read our stuff and they're very enthusiastic about it. When they come to you, they know you as the low carb doc. They come to you, they're excited about that approach, they're enthusiastic about that approach. Maybe not everybody, but certainly a larger majority of a larger amount of people. And that can produce echo chambers where we think this is how everyone in the world thinks, and we need to make everybody else in the world think like us. And one of the great things about social media is I've realized, hey, not everybody thinks like you, dummy. And we need to be more inclusive. And so that's why, unfortunately, I'm going to wrap this up, Dave. Unfortunately, we've gotten to the point where I interviewed a guy named Alan Levinovitz yesterday, and he was actually on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he has a book, but he talked about information silos. Basically, we are starting to get isolated into information silos based on the way social media shows us our content. It shows us what we want to see. And so we have this with our communities, right? All we see, if we're plant-based, we're following plant-based people. We're not following the other side. All we're seeing is how great plant-based is. So when we meet somebody else who plant-based didn't go well for, we go, what the fuck is wrong with you? And same thing for low carb. We're following everybody in the low carb community. What the fuck is wrong with you? Why didn't this work? And flexible dieting and so on and so forth. So my thing would be, I want to be super inclusive, but I just want people to be really careful about the messaging because I see how much food anxiety there is.
Okay, so I want to come in here again. I want to look, we're talking about orthorexia. We're talking about food anxiety, and you're absolutely right. This is a good segue into the next conversation we're going to have.
Say that one more time.
You're talking about orthorexia and food anxiety, and these are absolutely.
No, I'm just being a jerk and having you repeat that I was right. That's all.
Oh, did I even say that? I don't remember. Look, let's just come back. Forget about like the zealots and the confusion out there in the world, right? Let's just come back to there's two things that I want to talk about that we didn't get to talk about. One is adherence. Okay, we talked about adherence, and as a physician, when I'm guiding somebody in a diet. Okay, there are tools with a ketogenic diet that are unmatched compared to any other tool for any other diet. So when we're talking about a best diet, I like you, I don't believe in a best diet. I think majority can benefit from a low carb diet. I believe that. Okay, I believe that certainly people can benefit from these other diets. Okay, yeah, certainly this is the bottom line here. When you are should I just wait? I'll just wait. It's for the audience.
No, it's just getting very hot in my office, so I had to turn the AC up.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Look, the bottom line is with a low carbohydrate diet, we have a tool for adherence. It's called a ketone meter. Okay, we have another tool for adherence. It's called the CGM. In fact, it's an immediate way to isolate the difficulty patients may or may not have with a low carbohydrate approach. And in fact, it is probably more helpful to determine if somebody in fact will not tolerate a low carbohydrate diet, right? So we have a tool that tells us, hey, look, hey, maybe this diet isn't for you. You're struggling so much. It seems like these foods are coming back for whatever reason, whether you like it, whether you're addicted to it, whatever the reason, maybe we not have to try a different approach. But we have that tool, a CGM for adherence with the low carbohydrate approach. We have the ketone meter for adherence. So if you're talking about adherence to a diet as a factor that should guide, and making sure it's the right fit for a patient, though the low carbohydrate realm has these tools that a low fat realm doesn't, unless you're going to sit there and do a point of care lipid panel and check for triglyceride excursions, which would be, it's just not readily available. So with regards to adherence, I think there's an advantage to low carb diets for people like me in the setting that we have to see a lot of people and we have to try to help them with weight loss. All right. The second thing I want to talk about is, the messaging. Okay. Because you mentioned metabolism, and I want to bring these up, okay, really quickly. When everybody knows this, why are they in a food coma after they eat? And something really interesting that David Ludwig showed was that there is a decrease in total body energy about 2 hours after high carb meals. Okay, total body energy, meaning the fat and the glycemia combined. Okay, and then certainly another study, which I know we can talk about, is his study that showed that, hey, look, there's an increase in resting energy expenditure on low carb diets versus high carb diets. There may be an effect on metabolism of low carb diets. I am not saying this is the reason to do it. Okay, I'm not saying these are reason to do it. And what I'm saying is it explains some of the findings that quote unquote zealots, okay, and why they adhere, why they prefer this diet. It is important to understand, why is it that patients prefer a diet? Now, if they prefer flexible dieting because they get more food inclusionism and it helps their food anxiety, they should do that. And that is their primary goal. They should do that. Okay, but we have to be very clear in messaging what diets will improve what. And to whitewash all the diets, low carb, low fat, intermittent fasting, they're all the same. It's not true. How does intermittent fasting work? It decreases hunger and cravings. That's how it works. It's harder to overeat food in a narrow window. That's how it works. Okay, so it works because meal frequency comes so close together that you auto restrict calories. That is how intermittent fasting works. So we cannot say that these work the same. Portion control and intermittent fasting are not the same. So we have to be very clear with messaging. I agree. How does the low-fat diet work? How does the flexible dieting work?
But why don't we see if carbs make people so hungry, why don't we just see such massive differences in weight loss with ad libitum?
I don't think it's carbs in general. I think we have to take fiber out, right? I think fiber probably provides some fullness. And I think it matters about the host, right? I think if you are insulin sensitive, you will actually get satiety from having carbohydrates when insulin goes to the brain and centrally acts and tells you you're not hungry. And if you're not having a major blood glucose fluctuation, right? So I really think that it comes down to the host. If you can absorb, if you're an athlete, I'm guessing carbs actually make you satiated. Imagine you're hypoglycemic, right? And you eat carbs, you'd be satiated, right? You'd feel satiety. I think it comes down to the host factors, and maybe we don't know. It could be we don't know, right? I suspect it has to do with the host factors, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and glycemic variability, along with these hormonal factors. But I don't know the answer. I just know what I see and what's in the medical literature.
All right, so I want to respond to a couple things specifically. The idea that hunger is mostly driven by fluctuations in blood glucose has been shown to be, it may have an effect, but it's not the dominant effect. But I want to respond. Hunger is obnoxiously complicated. Obnoxiously complicated. It is extremely complicated. I'm fully comfortable in saying no scientist completely understands the hunger axis. It is unbelievably complicated. But I want to respond specifically to the Ludwig study. So that was the study on energy expenditure during weight maintenance. Now, there's numerous problems with Ludwig's study. And I see this, and I'm not trying to pick on you, Troy. This study gets cited ubiquitously in the low carb community. So they used a method called doubly labeled water to estimate energy expenditure. Now, I've done stable isotope methodology, and it was integral to my PhD. Stable isotopes are very expensive. They're hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement, analyze, and report. It's not difficult to stick a scale under people's feet. Now, in their pre-registered clinical trial, they collected data on weight and body composition. They did not report that data. Now, why would that be? If they're showing differences in energy expenditure of what they show was almost 400 calories a day difference, we would see differences in body weight. So why did they not report that? That seems incredible to me. Further, there was no difference. They actually reported, they kind of hid it in the tables, but they reported resting energy expenditure, which is the same as your BMR. It was no different amongst groups. and physical activity was not different amongst groups. So if it's not those, where is that difference in total daily energy expenditure coming from? And even like, let's say this study was
You want me to answer that? Because
Go ahead.
So the answer, so there's work from Ben Bickman proved in so they demonstrated the model in rodents, and they did fat biopsies in humans to at least suggest part of it. Okay, which is uncoupling or decoupling at the level.
But that would show up in resting energy expenditure.
Right, at the level of mitochondria. On fat biopsies in humans, they showed that this does occur. There's increased mitochondrial respiration. So there's a plausible mechanism.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that if that was actually the case, if that was occurring and explaining this, they would have seen differences in resting energy expenditure, which they didn't. Because your total daily energy expenditure is the summation of your resting energy expenditure plus your physical activity, whether it's NEAT or exercise activity, and your thermic effect of food. Now, if people want to argue it's the thermic effect of food because that wasn't analyzed, that's a really difficult argument to make when every single study shows that if anything, carbohydrate has a greater thermic effect of food than fat. And your thermic effect of food is usually less than 10% of your total daily energy expenditure. Now, the other thing is doubly labeled water has been shown before to overestimate energy expenditure during low carb diets. And they actually, so in their, I'm going to get pretty technical here because I'm familiar with stable isotopes, but the standard methodology for doubly labeled water is you take measurements at the end of diet or at the end of your treatment compared to baseline. In their preclinical trial, they registered it as that. Once the researchers became unblinded to the data,
That's not true. That's not true. It was blinded data, right?
It was blinded, but once the researchers became unblinded, they changed their preclinical trial.
That's not true. They didn't break the blind when they changed their. I've talked to David Ludwig myself about this.
Okay,
just
all
to
right.
clarify, because I asked the same thing.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Okay, so for whatever reason, then they changed their preclinical trial registration to make comparisons to post weight loss. Only then was the data significant. And if you do the calculations based on their original preclinical trial registration, they don't see differences. Now, that's super technical. Most people are going to understand that. I don't fully understand it. But my thing is, if you actually had 400 calories a day of difference, you would see weight loss if that was real. Weight wasn't reported. Body composition wasn't reported. Isn't that the primary endpoint that we're looking for? And then finally, even if you add this study to Hall's meta-analysis, it moves it a little bit. So basically the summation of the data still shows no advantage of energy expenditure for low carb diets. Now, again, I'm not saying low carb diets suck. I'm just saying this study stands alone and there are all kinds of issues with this study.
So I just want to come back to it because, okay, I asked him myself, I said, did you guys look at the data? Did you peek at the data? Did you have access to the data? All the data was was blinded with a statistician. The primary investigators had absolutely no. So I was concerned about the same thing. I'm like, wait a second, Kevin Hall's making some good points, right? And I talked to him specifically, and the blind was never broken. And so that's an important factor, right? Because we don't.
Okay, well, I don't want to libel them, so my apologies if that's the case.
Yeah, and because it's an absolute criticism. When we analyze pharmaceutical industry, we try to analyze it with a similar lens. So I appreciate the fact that we're taking this critical look at it. Now, the second thing is, what Kevin Hall did was he removed some outliers, okay, to show that there was an equalization of some of the data. And you're absolutely right. Why didn't they just report weight loss? Well, they actually tried to maintain weight, okay, to show the effect that this is not driven by weight loss, right? It is just driven by dietary composition and not by weight loss. So I think, certainly if you ran a trial and just said lose as much weight as you can and lower your carbs, we'd expect 1 to 2 pounds, maybe water, maybe not, okay, at 6 months would be the difference, right? And so this would confound changes in metabolism. So I think the reason why they didn't just focus on the weights is because they were trying to keep the weight stable. And from what I understand, the weights were not statistically significant amongst groups, which was the intention to isolate. Okay, is there some factor on metabolism and insulin status? And then
right, but if that was the case, they would have had to feed them significantly more, and they should have seen something in resting energy expenditure or physical.
well, that was the point, to feed them more if they're losing weight.
Then why
right?
didn't they report those food intakes?
So, my discussion with Ludwig is that those actually will come out in subsequent studies, which he's already done. Like there are subsequent studies coming out. Now, the other issue that we brought up here is comparing it to Kevin Hall's original meta-analysis, which is very short term. The key feature of this diet was its long-term feedings. It's a long-term feeding study. And so I think that it deserves some merit, right? It
was 12 weeks, right?
5 months, right? 5 months.
5 months in total, but I believe the weight maintenance phase was 12 weeks.
Yeah, so which is longer than almost, I think it's 1 month is what Kevin Hall looked at. Okay.
It depends on the study. Some of those studies were longer. Like the Johnston study was 6 weeks. Some of them were longer, but it's hard to be.
It's short-term studies. And I think the other issue here is, what is a short-term effect? Certainly we know in the short term that probably there's not a lot of change in the metabolic, but certainly we can surmise that there may be some long-term effects. And again, I don't think this is a reason to do a low-carb diet. I think the reason to do a low-carb diet is you'll probably be less hungry, you'll probably lose a little bit more weight, your blood sugar will improve, and you'll resolve fatty liver. And your blood pressure will improve, and your triglycerides will improve. I view those as primary reasons, calorie for calorie. I view those as primary reasons.
That's not what the meta-analyses say in the data.
Right. So we presented the data. We'll let people, come to the conclusions they want. I want to come back to one last thing. Okay. And we talked about this. We talked about, food preference. We talked about anxiety around food. And one of the big criticisms of low carb diets has been and again, we have to understand the situation in the medical and the dietetics community. It is highly biased against low carbohydrate approaches. Gary Fettke has been put on trial. Tim Noakes has been put on trial. Atkins was vilified. Low carbohydrate approaches will give you a heart attack according to the news media. Okay, so if we're talking about messaging and we're talking about the common message here, fasting, intermittent fasting, tell your average doctor that you're going to do intermittent fasting. They'll think you're insane. Okay, they'll say,
yeah, but this isn't really relevant to the topic.
No, it is. I'm going to tell you how it is. So, and when you go to a diet, most dietitians, most doctors will say, well, just reduce your calories and try to have a balanced diet. Okay. So and try to have lean meats, more whole grains, more vegetables. This is a bias against low carbohydrate approaches. Okay. Whole grains, balanced diets, right? If a low carbohydrate diet makes you less hungry, you eat less frequently, you're literally excluding foods, right? Whole grains, whole wheats, rice, right? You're excluding foods, but getting positive outcomes. That is not in line with the typical message by the guidelines, by the average physician, by the average dietitian. Okay. If you do intermittent fasting and you skip breakfast and you skip lunch, right, and eat in a narrow window, this is not balanced meals. So the problem is messaging, and it's not the low carb community. Okay. The problem in messaging is that there is a strong bias. And I asked this at Obesity Society. Okay. Is adherence to intermittent fasting affected by the standard messaging? And some of the most prominent researchers in intermittent fasting say yes. The legacy messaging of eating lean meats, whole grains, and more fruits and vegetables, okay, is a problem, and well-balanced meals throughout the day is a problem for people looking to adhere to low carb and intermittent fasting. Okay, and now you're right. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. Okay, one last statement. So when we're talking about messaging, there's a strong bias against these approaches. And when people come in here and I have to undo, when patients walk into my office, I have to undo that bias so they can heal. Okay, that's it.
Let me have 30 seconds.
Just real quick. Yeah, we need to get to the wrap-up points. I owe you about 4.5 minutes. I would have added more to Tro from the interjections.
I don't think I'll need it.
And then we'll go to the next question. And just, of course, you guys have already talked about a lot of things that will be brought up in the next question anyway. Just think of the next question as the last jump off point, but really past that point, you guys can, the floor is pretty much open. I'm sure a lot of these subjects will converge. Go ahead, Layne.
So I think Tro brings up the messaging, which I agree is very important. And Whether or not the literature is biased, I mean, I think I don't go to individual doctors' offices and ask them what they think of low carb, and I try not to think about anecdote too much, just because it can be very skewed. Um, when I went through and read most of these meta-analyses, the typical messaging that I saw was low carbohydrate may be a viable approach to reduce body weight and improve blood lipids, but it doesn't seem to be independently effective more than other approaches. So that's not really a biased, that's not really saying low carb sucks, right? And the problem is that, again, these information silos, what I say, hey, low carb doesn't appear to be better. What people hear, Layne said low carb sucks. That's what people hear, unfortunately. And part of that may be due to the sensitivity of, we have these diet wars. You got plant-based people telling you that you're going to get a heart attack tomorrow because you're eating a high-fat diet, that sort of thing. And so people become very sensitive to that. But, it's the same messaging where people say, well, Layne's promoting eating Pop-Tarts. By the way, I don't know how the fuck I got associated with Pop-Tarts. I don't like Pop-Tarts. They're not in my house. Now you can give me some Tim Tams. Anybody ever had Tim Tams? Australian candy? Fucking great. You give me some of those, I'm all down for that. But again, the messaging is super important, because the door is swinging back the other way. Because what tends to happen is we see this in culture as well. When there's a group that has been wronged, or, in this case, low carb has been, unfairly demonized previously, we have kind of this reactionary response where it has to be overcompensated for. And that produces unintended consequences. So you said you have people come to you, and they're really worried about like what people have told them. And well, I get the same thing of people coming from the low carb community saying, well, I was told that, I can't have fruit because it'll increase my insulin. And then I have to undo that kind of, that sort of nonsense. So I think it really goes both ways. And I think the problem, especially with Twitter, and I'm not blaming Twitter because it's a great platform, and obviously there's a lot of discourse that goes on there, but you have a really short period of time to make your point, right? You have a very short to make your point. And also, people respond to what they get reactions from, right? So they make really brash, bold statements because it wants to get the response. And I'm guilty of this too, just like anybody else. It's really hard to have nuanced discussion. I tried to do it a few weeks ago when I was talking about why people don't like the concept of calories in, calories out. A lot of it boils down to feeling like somebody's telling you you're gluttonous. And I had to write like 8 different tweets in a thread. And you know what happens? Nobody reads the entire thread. They just read the first thing that you put down. So I 100% agree. The messaging is very important. And I don't doubt that perhaps low carb has been unfairly demonized. I think the one thing that the researchers, not the doctors or not the people who are on, TV, I think the one thing I will say, I feel like low carb has actually been very well represented in the media recently, seems to be the darling. But I will say, one thing, and damn it, I lost my train of thought. I have it every once in a while. But my point is, we just need to be careful about the messaging. The messaging is important. If we overcompensate with the messaging, it produces unintended consequences, whether it's people in the intermittent fasting community saying you cannot lose fat unless you don't eat for certain periods of time, or it's people in the low carb community or people in the plant-based community. It's pervasive. And I'm sure flexible dieting as well. People have asked, part of the problem is I get people asking me, hey, Layne, can I have this food and can I be healthy and eat it? And I can say, well, yeah, you can. You're going to have to do more work, because at the end of the day, if you're talking about energy balance, it is a budget. Now you can lose weight without a budget, or sorry, you can lose weight without tracking your calories, 100%. Just like you can save money without a budget, right? But a budget is a tool, and many people find it helpful. Some people don't. It's the same thing for tracking calories. And I want to be clear, one more point. Tracking calories is not the same thing as calories in, calories out. One is a thermodynamics and one is a tool. So we need to find ways to figure out what tool fits the individual best and let them use that.
Okay, so
Okay,
I
we
want
hear
to
about-
talk about this tracking calories as a tool. I know we're wrapping up here. Okay, so first of all, they've done studies, the legacy messaging of more whole foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains. They've given them in food banks to people with food insecurity. This is the FAITH-DM trial. Okay, and it literally improved 0 outcomes in diabetes. That was a 6-month feeding study. Okay, in the ad lib setting, they literally gave them fruits, vegetables, whole grains, oatmeal, tons of real good foods. Never improved diabetes. So certainly sticking to the legacy messaging that the guidelines and most doctors and dietitians are saying of food inclusionism, I don't think is working. Okay, and this was the people that would benefit from food the most. Okay, I want to come back to calories because you mentioned that. If in New York City, when they displayed calories on menus and on all the messaging in the restaurants, it did nothing to intake. When they've done studies where they literally tell people at the cash register how many calories everything has, it doesn't change the amount that they eat. The knowledge of calories does not change the main drivers to eat, which are food preference, appetite, hunger, cravings. That is what drives calories.
I agree.
Okay?
But
so again, that's fine. If we agree, then this is good. This is why the messaging of calories in and calories out is harmful. Okay, and I believe so. And I'll say why it's harmful, because it does not. Calories do not drive intake. Now, relying on central planning, okay, to drive intake, all right, is a finite resource. And we talked about how stress. You mentioned childhood stress increases food intake, and obesity is strongly associated with obesity. How does it do that? How does it do that? It does that through insulin resistance. It does that through glycemic variations. Cortisol literally causes shifts in blood sugar. Okay, it literally causes hyperinsulinemia. All right, so we have to be, it's not the knowledge of calories, tracking of calories will not change why you are eating. Literally analyzing why you are eating. Why are you hungry? Why are you eating? What is driving your appetite? That will drive intake. Okay, that will drive intake. Knowing why you are eating is the number one most important thing to drive how many calories you actually take in, not knowing how many calories you take in. All right. And ultimately, we know in the free living world, so you don't have to use your central planning to govern your intake, that high protein, adequate fat, okay, stable blood sugar, right, in the setting of a low carb ketogenic diet will decrease intake. Certainly it will do it with a whole food plant-based diet as well for other reasons. We know that intermittent fasting is easier to track and results in a decrease in caloric intake. It is easier to track hours than calories. What happened? For some people.
For some people.
Yes, absolutely. Does calorie tracking hurt anybody? No. If it works for you, great. But the concept of focusing on calories supports companies that make food that is hard to control. Okay. It supports food preference. All right. It does not necessarily support people who are trying to decrease their intake. Certainly, it doesn't hurt. But is it an expensive waste of cerebral and mental focus that could be driven towards what is making you hungry? Why are you eating? Right? What makes you full? Do you get enjoyment out of that Pop-Tart that leaves you so full that you don't eat anything else? Great. Right? Or does that Pop-Tart make you more hungry 3 hours later because your blood sugar goes up? And David Ludwig showed that 2 hours after having a high carb meal, total blood energy is down and glycemic variability increases cravings. So that is the question. What should we focus our mind power on? Okay. And I think the legacy messaging of calories, look, I was 350 pounds, right? I've been there. I've been in your shoes, everybody's shoes, right? I've tried to count my way out of it. And let me tell you, calorie knowledge didn't drive that. Satiating foods, figuring out my reasons for eating, figuring out what foods fill me up and keep me full, that is what drives intake. And the problem is Coca-Cola doesn't benefit from that messaging. They benefit from telling you, and they've done this since 1990, you have to exercise more and you have to know your calories. That has been their messaging since 1990 through ILSI and through the GEBN.
I'm not really concerned with Coca-Cola's messaging and what they're trying to do. I'm more concerned about what helps individual people. And again, if you look at, you brought up that they put calories on menus that didn't change intake. That does not surprise me one single iota. Because if we look at dietary studies and we look at the long-term effects, all diets fail pretty miserably for the most part, whether that's low carb, whether it's plant-based, whether it's counting calories, whether it's Jenny Craig, whether it's zone diet, that sort of thing. But interestingly, in one of these studies where they stratified for adherence amongst individuals who were least adherent to most adherent, it was a linear association with long-term weight reduction. Now, what that says is, again, as I've been emphasizing, we need to find what works best for the individual. For some people, absolutely calorie tracking is not a useful tool, just like for some people, having a budget doesn't really help them that much. But for some people, that calorie tracking or that budget allows them more flexibility and that increases adherence. But for some people, it gives them anxiety. They feel confused. They get obsessed about hitting numbers, and for those people, maybe that's not for them. But but we could make the same arguments with low carb, plant-based. We could make the same arguments with any diet because all the dietary literature is really messy. And I would hope that you would agree with me, and perhaps I'm wrong, but again, when it comes to the individual, and I think, Tro, do you agree that if somebody is 300 pounds or overweight or obese, just getting them to a healthy body weight, regardless of the methodology, is the most important thing, as long as it's not like some crazy, insane sort of methodology?
Yeah, well, hold on. Let's be clear. Weight loss will definitely improve their health for somebody who has obesity. Absolutely. I agree with that message.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So in that case, it's very important for them to understand, and I think empowering for people to understand that you have all these tools at your disposal. You literally have hundreds of different methodologies that are at your disposal. And it's up to you and the individual, and hopefully us as practitioners, that we can start to identify what might work better for an individual and start to implement that, and not be dogmatic about what kind of approaches are going to be best, because on the whole, it doesn't appear we have a best approach. Our best bet, compliance, is the science. So trying to really emphasize individual compliance is such a huge component, and what I really try to get with my messaging, and it gets lost sometimes, and part of that's my fault. Compliance is the science, and whatever diet feels least restrictive for you as the individual, whether it's low carb, plant-based, low fat, flexible dieting, whatever diet methodology feels the least restrictive and feels the easiest, that's what we should be striving for. Thank you, Dave.
Tro, real quick, I'm gonna drive this to an equitable ending. You have 3 minutes, and then I'm giving each of you a 4-minute wrap up that I'm gonna hold to a hard time. Okay?
Perfect.
Okay, I got one last point on the diets, because I think this is really important. There was excellent meta-analysis done that actually took low carb diets, weight loss diets, right? Low carb and low fat. Okay, they took the extremes of both, really, and then they did a meta-analysis on total nutrient intake. And I think this is really relevant, and I want to focus on it right here. Okay, because they actually found, all right, that increasing carbohydrates was associated with weight gain. Okay, and they took low fat and low carb and put it together, and they found that increasing protein, as Layne had mentioned, is associated with weight loss. But interestingly, fat intake was actually associated with weight loss. Okay, I found this interesting. When you look at all diets and you break down the nutrient and you aggregate all the data, and I'd suggest everybody go see the study, it appears that carbohydrates have a negative effect on total weight, and it appears that protein and fat both have some positive effects, and that could be due to the baseline diet of the individual, right, compared to the change. So we can't infer everything. And there's one more study I'd like to put. If you aggregate, with over 118 data points on the lowest intake in diets seen, and you look at it with regards to carbohydrates, fat, and protein, certainly there's a huge effect from protein, but you'll see that the biggest decrease in ad lib intake is essentially under 30%, 50% of calories from carbohydrates, and certainly protein and fat have a critical role in seemingly decreased intake. I want to touch on one last point, which is the food anxiety that you talked about, and orthorexia and causing eating disorders, because this is a big, there's a big movement in dietetics here to protect people with anorexia. I've publicly shared that I've had anorexia, I've had binge eating, and that these are issues that I've suffered with. And many dietitians want to protect these patients with anorexia, and they want to protect patients that have these eating disorders. And certainly the work of Agnes Ayton has shown that there's a deep relationship between ultra-processed food and eating disorders. And I want to just touch on it before we leave, but we've literally done a case series in this office where we've reduced binge eating symptoms with the ketogenic diet. So to say that restrictive eating by itself worsens or causes an eating disorder, I think is worth mentioning. Okay. When I looked at the data regarding eating disorders, what I was able to find is certainly dieting in general is a risk factor. Okay. And I did not find any data that said flexible dieting was any more or less of a risk factor for eating disorders. But what was more concerning was the key issue there, and I got 1 minute here, Dave. The key issue there seems to be thin idealization, okay, and certainly mental health issues seem to be the causative role, okay. And the reason why I say that is because the best evidence for eating disorder prevention, okay, has been actually like healthy weight and healthy weight 2, or interventions that seem to prevent. That actually, I should say, not seem prevented eating disorders in at-risk college women, okay? They actually prescribed a diet, okay, of whole, real foods, healthy foods, and focusing on, if you're snacking, having a healthy snack. So literally an intervention of dieting, along with mental health support, improved and decreased the incidence of an eating disorder. I do not believe that restrictive dieting is causative in eating disorders. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this has been used by dietitians to bias against low carbohydrate approaches.
Okay, you both have 4 minutes each. I'm going to have my hand up the entire time. You'll be able to see me counting down with my hand. And I'm even going to do a 10-finger countdown before I announce time. We're going to start with you, Layne. Are you ready?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, go ahead. You have your closing statement. I would ask each of you not to interrupt each other. Go.
Yeah, so just real quick, there is one study looking at a flexible model of control versus a restrictive model of control. Did find, this is by Westenhofer in 1994, did find that a flexible result or a flexible control was associated with lower incidence of binge eating. But I'm not comfortable saying that restrictive diets cause eating disorders. I don't think the evidence is strong for that. I think possibly improving flexibility in mindset as well as diet may help, but the evidence is relatively weak. So, Tro, you brought up a good meta-analysis. I think the one thing I'll say about that meta-analysis that you brought up was that they didn't look at the change. So this meta-analysis looked at their intake and their body weights at 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. They used the wrong modulator variable, because you need to look at the change in calories. Because if you look at just the absolute calories, in a lot of those studies, I went through a lot of those studies one by one, the ketogenic diet groups just ate less in the first few months and lost more weight, which they came closer back together by the end, where they were not much difference in weight. And so the fact that carbohydrates were inversely associated with weight loss, it was very weak inverse association. And that's just not supported by the rest of the data that carbohydrates are independently fattening of calories. So I just wanted to clear that one up, that part of that is because you're looking at, they're not looking at the change in calorie intake. They're looking at the absolute calorie intake at those various points. So from months 1 till 3, if their intake was lower, but at month 3, it had come back up, they're going to show a similar calorie intake, even though they ate less calories during the duration. So anyway, that's out of the way with that. I'm going to go back to the overall messaging, which is low carbohydrate is a viable approach to improving body composition and weight loss. Low fat is also a viable approach. Balanced diets are also a viable approach. Flexible dieting is a viable approach. Plant-based viable approach. Whether or not it is a viable approach for you depends on your own unique psychology. And a lot of people want to make it just about appetite as well. And that's something we didn't even touch on. But a lot of people just say, well, this is the most satiating thing. But what improves adherence doesn't necessarily have to do with satiety either, just from people being satiated, because otherwise we would see huge differences in benefits between diets that are like, for example, plant-based and low fat, or low carb. We would see huge differences because people aren't getting hungry. But these people have the similar recidivism rates back to normal. And that's because hunger or intake is a much more complex physiological, psychological, and sociological issue. Even if you just look at dinner plates from the 1800s, they were this big versus now. When you go to a social event, how often have you gone to a social event and there hasn't been food? There's a lot of things to unpack with this. And so being very flexible in our messaging and presenting these things as tools is very important. And just understanding that if you find a methodology that works for you, and that allows you to achieve a calorie deficit, lose weight, and keep it off, that is the right approach for you, regardless of what somebody else says. And that's my ending statement. Thank you.
Yeah,
you have 4 minutes.
I absolutely agree. If you've lost weight and reversed your health with, whatever approach, if you have concrete markers of improvement, like, right here in our office, we have a point of care lipid panel where we literally can check your lipids, give you results in 5 minutes. We give you CGMs so that you don't have to believe me. You can concretely see the improvements in your health. You don't have to believe Layne. You don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe, the low fat guy, the plant-based guy. You don't have to believe me. I will give you the tools to look. And I advise everybody to get those tools, a CGM, get access to labs so that you can check your individual health. Okay. Having done this again and again, I can tell you that there's a substantial improvement in overall health with low carbohydrate and intermittent fasting approaches. What I'd like to come back to is a concept. I'm a huge espionage fan. I love, the whole propaganda, Russians versus the United States, Cold War, China. And the last thing I want to be is a useful idiot. Okay. I don't want to be somebody where they will, I will repeat the mantra, I will repeat the statements until they're truthful, right? I don't want to repeat the things and the propaganda and nutrition that I've talked about. I don't want to repeat those things like controlling for calories and controlling for protein, right? Because that makes me a useful idiot. I don't want to do that. I don't want to fall into that trap because it supports the food companies. It doesn't put the power in the hands of the people that Layne is talking about. He's talking about if it works for you, you should do that diet. Okay. If it works for you. And I do not think on your way to finding out what diet you should do, I don't think you should listen to the majority of the news media, doctors, dietitians who bias against low carb approaches. I should take that back. Listen to them, but consider other sources. And finally, I want to end with a quote here. Okay, on page 181 of Fat Loss Forever, it says right here, at best, the people presenting the research are too ignorant to understand what the data is actually telling them. And this is something that I really feel strongly about. Okay, this is why I got board certified in obesity medicine. This is why I'm putting out case series on low carbohydrate approaches, because I never want to be that useful idiot that Layne really cautions about. I don't want to be and that's why it's been very important for us in my podcast to not accept commercials or outside, sources of funding. But my wife can't stop it from being entrepreneurial, so I have to disclose her. Look, the idea here is the bottom line. I agree with everything Layne has said about doing the diet that works for you. I would never tell you, if you come into my office and you're doing vegetarian or plant-based, I would never tell you, and it's working and your verified markers of health are improving, I'd never tell you to do otherwise. I would just tell you there is a strong evidence that lowering your sugar and processed carbs is probably helpful. And certainly not fearing fat and healthy fats is probably helpful overall.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This has just been incredible. I do want to emphasize to everybody who's watching right now, if you've enjoyed this debate, recognize that both these gentlemen were very adamant about doing it for charity. Their time is very valuable. My time's a tiny bit valuable. So if you really support both,
come on, Dave.
so if you support this debate and our endeavors, you can see links to the respective charities at citizensciencefoundation.org/debate. And we'd love to encourage you to use the hashtag #DonatedForDebate, especially on Twitter. And of course, feel free to carry on the conversation from here. Let us know what your thoughts were on this debate, and we hope to see you again soon.
Go donate, people.